Case 1. Bernard Lawrence Madoff. For decades, Bernard Madoff was Wall Street royalty, a former chairman of NASDAQ, a trusted advisor to charities and universities, a man whose investment firm carried his own name and reputation. Clients felt privileged just to have their money managed by him. His returns were steady, his demeanor calm, his pedigree impeccable. But behind the mahogany desk and the carefully maintained facade, Madoff was running the largest financial fraud in American history. Bernard Lawrence Madoff was born in Queens, New York, in 1938. He founded Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, LLC, in 1960, building it into one of Wall Street's most respected firms. Madoff helped develop the technology that became NASDAQ and served as its chairman. By the time he reached his 60s, he managed billions of dollars for thousands of clients. His reputation was sterling. His word was trusted without question. What made Madoff's scheme so effective was its apparent legitimacy. He didn't target only the wealthy. His client list included Holocaust survivors who had rebuilt their lives, retirees who had spent decades saving for security, charities that served vulnerable populations, and universities managing endowments. These weren't marks to Madoff. They were believers in his carefully constructed myth of consistent returns. The fraud was elegant in its simplicity. Madoff told investors he was using a sophisticated strategy called split-strike conversion. In reality, he was doing almost nothing. When clients deposited money, it went into a Chase Manhattan bank account. When they wanted to withdraw funds or see returns, Madoff used money from new investors to pay them. It was a classic Ponzi scheme named after Charles Ponzi, who ran a similar fraud in the 1920s. But Madoff's version operated on a scale Ponzi could never have imagined. The scheme worked because Madoff delivered exactly what investors wanted to see. His returns weren't flashy. They averaged around 10 to 12% annually, steady, predictable, believable. Month after month, year after year, clients received statements showing their accounts growing. The statements were fiction. Madoff employed a small team to generate elaborate fake documents. The trades listed on those statements never happened. The securities didn't exist. It was all fabrication. What Madoff understood was psychology. Investors didn't question success. When the stock market crashed, Madoff's clients saw modest positive returns. When the market soared, they saw steady gains. The consistency itself became the selling point. Friends told friends. Charities recommended him to other charities. His client list grew not through aggressive marketing, but through word of mouth and trust. There were warning signs. Financial analyst Harry Markopoulos spent years trying to convince the Securities and Exchange Commission that Madoff's returns were mathematically impossible. He submitted detailed reports in 2000, 2001, and 2005. The SEC conducted investigations but found nothing. Madoff's reputation and his connections protected him. Regulators couldn't believe that someone with his pedigree would risk everything for fraud. By 2008, Madoff was managing approximately $65 billion in client funds, or rather, his clients believed he was managing that amount. In reality, the money wasn't there. It had been spent, withdrawn by earlier investors, or simply never invested at all. When the financial crisis hit that fall, too many clients tried to withdraw funds at once. The scheme collapsed under its own weight. On December 10, 2008, Madoff confessed to his sons, Mark and Andrew. He told them the investment business was all just one big lie and that it was, basically, a giant Ponzi scheme. The next morning, his sons contacted federal authorities. FBI agents arrested Madoff at his Manhattan apartment on December 11th. He was 70 years old. The aftermath revealed the true scope of devastation. Thousands of investors learned their life savings had vanished. The Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity lost $15.2 million. Yeshiva University lost $110 million. Individual retirees who had believed their retirements were secure discovered they had nothing. Some victims lost everything they owned. Several committed suicide in the wake of discovering their losses. Madoff's own family suffered as well. His wife, Ruth, claimed she was unaware of the fraud. His sons, who had worked at the firm's legitimate trading operation, maintained they knew nothing of their father's scheme. Mark Madoff hanged himself in his Manhattan apartment in December 2010, exactly 2 years after his father's arrest. Andrew Madoff died of cancer in 2014, telling friends that the stress of the scandal had contributed to his illness. On March 12, 2009, Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 federal felonies, including securities fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and perjury. He offered no defense. In court, he read a prepared statement acknowledging his crimes, but claiming he had acted alone. Investigators never fully believed that claim. The fraud was too elaborate, too sustained, for one person to manage without help. But Madoff never implicated anyone else. At his sentencing hearing on June 29, 2009, victims filled the courtroom. They spoke of destroyed retirements, lost homes, and shattered trust. U.S. District Judge Denny Chin sentenced Madoff to the maximum, 150 years in federal prison. The judge called the fraud extraordinarily evil and noted that the sentence was largely symbolic given Madoff's age. Madoff would die in prison. Everyone in that courtroom knew it. Madoff was initially sent to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, then transferred to the medium-security Federal Correctional Institution in Butner, North Carolina. There, inmate number 617-27054 worked for pennies an hour and lived according to the same rules as every other prisoner. The man who once controlled billions now stood in line for meals in a prison cafeteria. While Madoff served his sentence, trustee Irving Picard worked to recover money for victims. The process was slow and complex. Picard had to untangle decades of fraudulent transactions, clawing back money from investors who had withdrawn more than they deposited. By 2021, the trustee had recovered approximately $14.4 billion of the $17.5 billion in principal that investors had actually deposited. It was an unprecedented recovery rate for a fraud case, but many victims never saw full restitution. Madoff gave occasional interviews from prison. He claimed remorse, but often seemed more interested in discussing the technical aspects of his scheme than the human cost. In a 2013 interview, he said he felt horrible about what he had done, but also complained about how he was perceived. He wanted people to understand that he hadn't started out intending to commit fraud. The Ponzi scheme, he claimed, began almost accidentally in the early 1990s during a recession when he couldn't meet redemption requests. Rather than admit failure, he chose deception. Whether that version of events was true became irrelevant. The fraud had continued for at least 17 years, possibly longer. Madoff had lied to his family, his clients, and regulators thousands of times. He had destroyed lives, bankrupted charities, and eroded trust in financial institutions. His claims of limited intention rang hollow against the reality of sustained, deliberate deception. On April 14, 2021, Bernard Madoff died at the Federal Medical Center in Butner. He was 82 years old and had been suffering from chronic kidney disease. He died in federal custody, having served less than 12 years of his 150-year sentence. News of his death brought little satisfaction to his victims. Many were already deceased themselves. Others remained financially devastated despite the trustees' recovery efforts. The Madoff scandal fundamentally changed how the Securities and Exchange Commission operates. The agency acknowledged it had failed to detect the fraud despite multiple warnings and tips. New protocols were implemented to investigate whistleblower complaints more thoroughly. Additional staff was hired specifically to monitor investment advisors. The financial industry faced new requirements for independent custody of client funds and verification of investment holdings. but the regulatory changes couldn't undo the damage. Charities that served vulnerable populations closed their doors. Retirees who had believed their futures were secure faced poverty. Universities cut programs and staff. The ripple effects touched thousands of lives in ways that couldn't be quantified or remedied. What made the case stand out was not just the scale, but the duration. Madoff had sustained the fraud for decades, successfully lying to sophisticated investors, financial professionals, and regulators. He had built such a reputation for integrity that people believed him even when the math didn't add up. His position as a NASDAQ chairman, his charitable work, his quiet confidence, all of it was weaponized in service of the lie. Bernard Madoff's name entered the language as shorthand for financial fraud. When someone wants to describe a Ponzi scheme, they call it a Madoff situation. His mugshot became iconic. The story of his arrest, trial, and imprisonment was told in books, documentaries, and television series. He became the face of a particular kind of white-collar crime, the trusted insider who betrays everyone. Even today, the name Madoff carries weight in financial circles. It represents a warning about the dangers of blind trust and the necessity of verification. It reminds investors that reputation is not the same as honesty, that pedigree doesn't equal integrity, and that even the most respected figures can be running elaborate frauds. The case demonstrated that when someone's returns seem too good to be true, too consistent to be real, skepticism is not just warranted, but essential. For the families he destroyed, for the charities he bankrupted, for the individuals who trusted him with their life savings, Bernard Madoff's death in prison offered little comfort. The money he stole didn't just disappear into abstractions. It represented children's college funds, retirement security, medical care, and dreams of financial stability. Those losses couldn't be recovered through the bankruptcy trustee's work, no matter how diligent. The human cost of Madoff's fraud extended far beyond any dollar amount. The devastation forced uncomfortable truths into public conversation. How many other frauds were hiding behind respectable facades? How many other trusted advisors were lying to their clients? How many regulatory failures had allowed Madoff to operate for so long? These questions lingered long after Madoff's death, reminding the financial industry and its regulators that the Bernard Madoff case was not just about one man's crimes, but about the systems that enabled them and the trust that was so catastrophically betrayed. Case 2. Sam Bankman-Fried. By age 30, Sam Bankman-Fried had become one of the cryptocurrency industry's brightest stars. He lived in a $40 million penthouse in the Bahamas, appeared on magazine covers, and commanded the attention of politicians and venture capitalists. He spoke at conferences about effective altruism, promising to give away his fortune to save the world. He wore shorts and drove a Toyota Corolla, cultivating an image of the reluctant billionaire who cared more about humanity than wealth. It was all performance. Behind the carefully constructed persona, Bankman-Fried was stealing billions of dollars from his own customers. Samuel Bankman-Fried was born in 1992 to two Stanford Law School professors. He grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, surrounded by academic achievement and intellectual ambition. After graduating from MIT with a degree in physics, he briefly worked as a trader at Jane Street Capital, a quantitative trading firm. But Bankman-Fried had bigger plans. He wanted to make money, lots of it, and then give it all away through a philosophy called effective altruism. In 2017, Bankman-Fried founded Alameda Research, a cryptocurrency trading firm. The premise was simple: exploit price differences in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies across different exchanges. The strategy worked. Alameda made hundreds of millions in profits. Bankman-Fried became wealthy quickly, and his reputation in the crypto world grew. But Alameda wasn't enough. In 2019, Bankman-Fried founded FTX, a cryptocurrency exchange where customers could buy, sell, and trade digital assets. The platform was sleek, professional, and user-friendly. Unlike many crypto exchanges that felt amateurish or sketchy, FTX projected legitimacy. Bankman-Fried positioned himself as the adult in the room, the person who would bring professionalism and ethics to the often chaotic cryptocurrency industry. FTX grew explosively. By 2021, the company was valued at $32 billion. Bankman-Fried's personal net worth was estimated at $26 billion, making him one of the richest people under 30. He bought naming rights to the Miami Heat's arena. He ran Super Bowl commercials featuring celebrities. He testified before Congress about cryptocurrency regulation. He donated tens of millions to political candidates from both parties. The media called him the next Warren Buffett and the J.P. Morgan of crypto. The image was carefully maintained. Bankman-Fried wore T-shirts and shorts to important meetings. He claimed to sleep on a beanbag in his office. He gave interviews where he discussed his vegan diet and his commitment to donating his wealth. He talked constantly about effective altruism, the philosophical movement that encourages earning money specifically to give it away to the most effective causes. Every detail reinforced the same narrative. Sam Bankman-Fried was different. He wasn't motivated by greed. He was building wealth to save lives. Behind that narrative, a massive fraud was unfolding. From the beginning, the relationship between FTX and Alameda Research was problematic. Bankman-Fried owned both companies. Caroline Ellison, his on and off romantic partner, ran Alameda. The two entities were supposed to be separate, but in practice, they operated as extensions of each other. And critically, Alameda had special privileges on the FTX platform. When customers deposited money on FTX, they expected those funds to be held safely. FTX's terms of service explicitly stated that customer assets belonged to the customers and would not be used by the company. Bankman-Fried repeated this promise in interviews, on social media, and in congressional testimony. It was a lie. Customer funds were being funneled to Alameda Research, where they were used for venture capital investments, political donations, real estate purchases, and to cover trading losses. The mechanics of the fraud were straightforward but devastating. FTX gave Alameda a virtually unlimited line of credit. When Alameda needed cash, it simply withdrew funds from FTX's customer deposits. No collateral was required, no limits were enforced. Bankman-Fried and his inner circle built backdoors into FTX's code that allowed Alameda to maintain a negative balance of billions of dollars. Customer money wasn't sitting in wallets on the blockchain. It was being spent. By 2022, Alameda Research had borrowed approximately $10 billion from FTX customer deposits. That money went toward a stunning array of expenditures. Bankman-Fried purchased luxury real estate in the Bahamas, including a $40 million penthouse where he and 9 other executives lived and worked. The company bought or invested in hundreds of other ventures, from media companies to biotech startups. Bankman-Fried made massive political donations, becoming one of the largest donors in the 2022 election cycle. The spending was reckless and unsustainable. Alameda's trading losses compounded the problem. When crypto prices crashed in 2022, Alameda's portfolio lost billions in value. The firm needed more money to cover its positions, so it took more from FTX customers. The hole kept getting deeper. By November 2022, Alameda owed FTX approximately $8 billion. There was no way to repay it. The scheme began to unravel when CoinDesk, a cryptocurrency news site, published details of Alameda Research's balance sheet. The report showed that much of Alameda's assets consisted of FTT, the native token of FTX. This revelation raised red flags. If Alameda and FTX were truly independent, why was Alameda's balance sheet so heavily dependent on FTX's own cryptocurrency? The article suggested the two companies were far more intertwined than Bankman-Fried had admitted. Changpeng Zhao, CEO of Binance, FTX's main competitor, announced his company would sell its holdings of FTT tokens. The announcement triggered panic. FTX customers rushed to withdraw their funds. Within days, withdrawal requests exceeded 5 billion. FTX couldn't meet the demands. The money wasn't there. On November 8, 2022, FTX halted withdrawals. On November 11th, the company filed for bankruptcy. The collapse was catastrophic. Approximately 1 million customers had funds trapped on the platform. Some had their entire life savings in FTX accounts. The company owed creditors more than 8 billion. Alameda Research was insolvent. The carefully constructed empire had evaporated in less than a week. Bankman-Fried initially tried to manage the narrative. He tweeted apologies and explanations, claiming he hadn't known about the magnitude of the problems. He gave interviews suggesting the collapse was due to a liquidity crisis, not fraud. He portrayed himself as a well-meaning CEO who had made mistakes but never intended to hurt anyone. Very few people believed him. On December 12, 2022, FBI agents arrested Bankman-Fried at his apartment in the Bahamas. He was extradited to the United States the next day. Federal prosecutors in Manhattan charged him with multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The indictment laid out in detail how Bankman-Fried had systematically looted customer funds to enrich himself and prop up his failing hedge fund. 3 of Bankman-Fried's closest associates quickly pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Caroline Ellison, the Alameda CEO and his former girlfriend, admitted she had committed fraud at his direction. Gary Wang, FTX's co-founder and chief technology officer, confessed to writing code that gave Alameda special privileges. Nishad Singh, FTX's engineering director, acknowledged participating in the scheme. All 3 agreed to testify against Bankman-Fried at trial. The trial began in October 2023 in federal court in Manhattan. Prosecutors presented mountains of evidence, internal messages, financial records, testimony from cooperating witnesses, and Bankman-Fried's own public statements. The case was overwhelming. But Bankman-Fried's legal team made a decision that shocked many observers. They put him on the stand to testify in his own defense. The testimony was a disaster. Bankman-Fried claimed he hadn't known about the misuse of customer funds until shortly before the collapse. He said he had been too busy to oversee financial controls. He suggested that other executives had made decisions without his knowledge. He contradicted his earlier public statements. He dodged questions and gave evasive answers. Judge Lewis Kaplan would later say Bankman-Fried had committed perjury on the witness stand. On November 2, 2023, after just over 4 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Bankman-Fried on all 7 counts. He showed little reaction. His parents, sitting in the courtroom, wept. Bankman-Fried was remanded to custody immediately, sent to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn to await sentencing. The sentencing hearing in March 2024 revealed the full scope of the fraud. Prosecutors argued Bankman-Fried should receive between 40 and 50 years in prison. His defense attorneys asked for no more than 6.5 years, arguing that FTX customers would likely recover most of their funds through bankruptcy proceedings. They portrayed Bankman-Fried as a misguided entrepreneur, not a deliberate criminal. Judge Kaplan rejected that narrative completely. In his sentencing remarks, he noted that Bankman-Fried had shown no genuine remorse. The judge said Bankman-Fried's testimony had been comprehensively false and that he had lied repeatedly to minimize his crimes. Kaplan noted there was a risk that this man will be in a position to do something very bad in the future. The judge described Bankman-Fried as a great marketing guy whose public persona had been carefully constructed to deceive people. On March 28, 2024, Judge Kaplan sentenced Samuel Bankman-Fried to 25 years in federal prison. He also ordered Bankman-Fried to forfeit $11 billion. The sentence was less than prosecutors requested, but more than double what the defense had sought. At 32 years old, Bankman-Fried faced the reality that he would spend much of his remaining youth and middle age behind bars. Before the sentencing, victims testified about the devastating impact of Bankman-Fried's fraud. One investor described speaking with thousands of FTX victims, many suffering from depression and taking medication to cope with their losses. Another said he had suffered every day for 2 years since the collapse. These weren't just financial losses. The fraud had caused genuine trauma, destroying people's sense of security and trust. Bankman-Fried made a brief statement before sentencing. He said he was sorry about what happened and acknowledged that customers and employees had been let down. But even in that moment, he couldn't fully accept responsibility. He talked about decisions that haunt him without specifying what those decisions were. He commended his former colleagues who had testified against him, saying they had all built something beautiful together. It was a strange, detached statement that seemed to confirm the judge's assessment that he lacked genuine remorse. The cryptocurrency industry watched the case closely. For years, crypto advocates had argued that the sector needed minimal regulation. They claimed that blockchain technology and market forces would prevent fraud. The FTX collapse exposed that argument as fantasy. Without proper oversight, customer funds were not safe. Without independent audits and financial controls, exchanges could operate as vehicles for theft. The case demonstrated that cryptocurrency platforms needed the same regulatory framework that governed traditional financial institutions. Bankman-Fried is currently serving his sentence in federal prison. His projected release date, accounting for good behavior credits, is sometime in the late 2030s. He will be in his 50s when he walks free, his youth and his fortune both gone. His parents, both law professors, have stood by him throughout the ordeal. His younger brother, who had worked in politics, partly funded by Sam's donations, has largely disappeared from public view. The bankruptcy proceedings continue. John Ray, the executive brought in to oversee FTX's liquidation, called it one of the worst corporate failures he had ever seen. Ray had previously worked on the Enron bankruptcy, one of the largest corporate scandals in American history, making his assessment of FTX particularly damning. The company's books were a mess. Funds had been commingled. Basic financial controls had never been implemented. Ray described the situation as a complete failure of corporate controls. Some customers may eventually recover a portion of their losses. The bankruptcy estate has recovered several $billion through asset sales and clawback lawsuits. The exact recovery rate remains uncertain. But even if customers recover every dollar they deposited, the fraud remains devastating. People who needed access to their funds couldn't get them. Opportunities were missed. Lives were disrupted. Trust was shattered. What makes the case stand out was the calculated nature of the deception. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. Bankman-Fried had billions of dollars in personal wealth. He didn't need to steal customer money. But he wanted more. He wanted political influence. He wanted to make massive venture capital bets. He wanted to live in a $40 million penthouse and position himself as a visionary. The fraud was driven by ambition and entitlement, not necessity. The effective altruism angle added a layer of cynicism to the crime. Bankman-Fried had spoken constantly about using his wealth to save lives and reduce suffering. He had positioned himself as someone motivated by ethics, not greed. The entire time he was stealing billions from people who trusted him. The philosophical framework he claimed to follow became just another marketing tool, a way to make himself seem more trustworthy and less threatening. Judge Kaplan's comments about the lack of remorse proved particularly prescient. Even after conviction, even facing decades in prison, Bankman-Fried continued to minimize his crimes. He maintained that FTX could have survived if not for a liquidity crisis. He suggested that his actions were mismanagement rather than fraud. He never fully acknowledged that he had deliberately stolen customer money and lied about it for years. That inability to accept responsibility, the judge noted, made him dangerous. The case sent shockwaves through the cryptocurrency industry. Billions of dollars had been wiped out. Thousands of people had lost their savings. A company valued at $32 billion had collapsed in days. The speed of the fall was almost unprecedented. More importantly, the fraud revealed fundamental weaknesses in how cryptocurrency exchanges operated. The industry's resistance to regulation had created an environment where a 30-year-old could control billions in customer funds with virtually no oversight. Sam Bankman-Fried's story is a reminder that intelligence and ambition without integrity become tools for destruction. He was undeniably smart. His understanding of markets and technology was sophisticated, but he used that intelligence to construct an elaborate fraud, hiding behind a persona of altruism, while enriching himself at his customers' expense. His 25-year sentence reflects not just the magnitude of the theft, but the calculated nature of the deception and his continued refusal to accept full responsibility. For the victims still waiting to recover their funds, for the employees who lost their jobs when FTX collapsed, for the cryptocurrency industry forced to reckon with its lack of oversight, Sam Bankman-Fried's imprisonment offers some measure of accountability. But it cannot undo the damage. The billions stolen are not easily recovered. The trust destroyed takes generations to rebuild. And the warning his case provides, that even the most celebrated entrepreneurs can be running massive frauds, will echo in boardrooms and trading floors for years to come. Case 3. Jeffrey Skilling Enron was supposed to be the future of American business. The company transformed from a sleepy natural gas pipeline operator into an energy trading powerhouse that seemed to redefine entire markets. Its executives were hailed as visionaries. Its stock price soared. Fortune magazine named it America's most innovative company for 6 consecutive years. At the center of this transformation stood Jeffrey Skilling, a former McKinsey consultant whose aggressive strategies and unshakable confidence drove Enron's meteoric rise. But the innovation was an illusion. The profits were fabricated. And when the truth emerged, Enron's collapse would become the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. Jeffrey Skilling was born in Pittsburgh in 1953. He studied applied science at Southern Methodist University before earning an MBA from Harvard Business School, where he graduated in the top 5% of his class. After Harvard, Skilling joined McKinsey & Company, the elite management consulting firm, where he specialized in energy and chemical industries. He was brilliant, driven, and confident to the point of arrogance. In 1990, Kenneth Lay, chairman of Enron, hired Skilling to help build the company's new trading operation. Skilling saw opportunity where others saw commodity. Natural gas was typically bought and sold through long-term contracts. Skilling envisioned a market where gas could be traded like stocks or bonds, with prices fluctuating based on supply and demand. He convinced regulators to allow Enron to use mark-to-market accounting for its trading business. This accounting method let Enron book the projected profits from long-term contracts immediately, rather than recognizing revenue gradually as contracts were fulfilled. Mark-to-market accounting worked well when honestly applied. The problem was that Enron's projections were often wildly optimistic. The company would sign a 20-year energy contract and immediately book all the anticipated profits. If the contract turned out to be less profitable than projected or even lost money, Enron didn't adjust the books to reflect reality. Instead, executives hid the losses and sought new deals to create fresh paper profits. The accounting became a shell game, constantly moving losses around to maintain the illusion of growth. Skilling rose rapidly through Enron's ranks. In 1997, he became president and chief operating officer. In February 2001, he was named CEO. By then, Enron had expanded far beyond energy trading. The company traded everything from bandwidth to weather derivatives. It owned power plants, pipelines, and water systems. It operated in dozens of countries. The complexity was dizzying, which was partly the point. The more complicated Enron's operations became, the harder it was for outsiders to understand what was really happening. What was really happening was fraud. Enron created an elaborate network of off-balance sheet entities designed to hide debt and inflate profits. These special-purpose entities had innocuous names like Chuco, Jedi, and the Raptors. In theory, they were independent partnerships. In practice, they existed primarily to manipulate Enron's financial statements. When Enron needed to hide debt, it would transfer the liability to one of these entities. When Enron needed to create profits, it would sell assets to these entities at inflated prices. Skilling signed off on many of these structures. He worked closely with Andrew Fastow, Enron's chief financial officer, who designed and managed the off-balance sheet partnerships. Fastow personally profited from these arrangements, collecting tens of millions in fees. But Fastow didn't act alone. Skilling knew about the partnerships. He approved their creation. He understood they were being used to manipulate Enron's financial results. One particularly egregious example was Chuco, an entity created ostensibly to buy out Enron's partner in a previous investment. Chuco was supposed to have independent equity investors, which would have kept it off Enron's balance sheet under accounting rules. But the independent investment was a sham. When this was discovered years later, Enron was forced to adjust its books, acknowledging $405 million in additional losses. It was the beginning of the end. Inside Enron, a culture of arrogance and intimidation flourished. The company used a rank and yank performance review system that forced managers to fire the bottom 15% of employees every year. This created intense competition and discouraged questioning authority. Employees who raised concerns about accounting practices were marginalized or pushed out. The message was clear: results mattered more than ethics. Skilling cultivated this culture. He rewarded executives who delivered impressive numbers and showed little interest in how those numbers were generated. He spoke confidently about Enron's prospects, even as internal analyses showed the company's businesses were struggling. When analysts questioned Enron's financial statements, Skilling responded with contempt. In a notorious April 2001 conference call, when an analyst pressed for more financial transparency, Skilling called him an unprintable name. The outburst shocked observers, but also revealed Skilling's attitude toward scrutiny. By mid-2001, cracks were appearing. Enron's stock price, which had reached $90 per share in August 2000, had fallen to around $50. Some analysts were openly questioning whether anyone could understand Enron's financial statements. Short sellers were betting against the company. Inside Enron, executives knew the situation was far worse than the public realized. The off-balance sheet entities were beginning to fail. Losses could no longer be hidden. The house of cards was collapsing. On August 14, 2001, Jeffrey Skilling abruptly resigned as CEO after only 6 months in the position. He claimed he was leaving for personal reasons, to spend more time with his family. Almost no one believed that explanation. Skilling had spent his entire career climbing toward the CEO position. Why would he abandon it so suddenly? The real reason was that Skilling saw what was coming and wanted distance from the disaster. Kenneth Lay, Enron's chairman, returned as CEO. He tried to reassure employees and investors that Enron was financially sound. On September 26th, at an employee meeting, Lay said the company was in strong shape and encouraged workers to buy Enron stock for their retirement accounts. Many employees did, using their life savings to purchase shares in a company that was weeks from bankruptcy. Lay knew, or should have known, that Enron was in dire straits. His reassurances were catastrophically misleading. On October 16th, Enron announced a $638 million loss for the third quarter. More significantly, the company disclosed that it would reduce shareholder equity by $1.2 billion to correct accounting errors related to the off-balance sheet partnerships. The announcement triggered panic. Enron's stock price plummeted. Credit rating agencies downgraded the company's debt. Business partners backed away from deals. The spiral accelerated. On November 8th, Enron announced it was restating earnings for the previous 5 years, acknowledging that it had overstated profits by nearly $600 million. The admission confirmed what many suspected. Enron's financial statements had been fiction. The stock price fell to less than $10 per share. Dynegy, a smaller energy company, briefly considered buying Enron but walked away after examining the books. There was no rescue coming. On December 2, 2001, Enron filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. At the time, it was the largest bankruptcy in American history, with $63 billion in assets. More than 20,000 employees lost their jobs. Many also lost their retirement savings, which had been invested heavily in Enron stock. The company's pension plan held $1.3 billion in Enron shares that were now worthless. Employees who had been encouraged to buy stock watched their futures evaporate. Federal investigators immediately launched a criminal probe. The scale of the fraud was staggering. Prosecutors discovered that Enron executives had systematically misrepresented the company's financial condition for years. They had hidden debt, inflated revenues, and lied to investors, employees, and regulators. And many top executives had enriched themselves by selling Enron stock while the fraud was ongoing, even as they encouraged rank-and-file employees to keep buying. Jeffrey Skilling was indicted on February 19, 2004, charged with 35 counts of fraud, conspiracy, insider trading, and lying to auditors. He maintained his innocence, insisting he had done nothing wrong. Kenneth Lay was also indicted. The two men would be tried together in one of the most closely watched white-collar criminal trials in American history. The trial began on January 30, 2006, in federal court in Houston. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of fraud. 8 former Enron executives testified for the government, many of them having pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate. The star witness was Andrew Fastow, the CFO who had designed many of the fraudulent schemes. Fastow testified that Skilling had known about and approved the off-balance sheet entities used to manipulate earnings. He described a culture where deception was normalized and concerns were dismissed. Skilling took the stand in his own defense. He testified that he had not known about the accounting fraud. He claimed Enron had been a fundamentally sound company brought down by a crisis of confidence, not criminal activity. He said the mark-to-market accounting was legal and appropriate. He insisted that he had resigned for personal reasons, not because he knew Enron was collapsing. His testimony was confident but not convincing. The evidence against him was too strong. On May 25, 2006, the jury convicted Skilling on 19 of 28 counts, including securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. He was acquitted on 9 counts, mostly related to insider trading. Kenneth Lay was convicted on all 6 counts against him. Both men faced decades in prison, but Lay would never serve a day. On July 5, 2006, while vacationing in Colorado, Kenneth Lay died of a heart attack. Because he died before sentencing and before his appeals were exhausted, his conviction was vacated. In the eyes of the law, Lay died an innocent man, though few doubted his guilt. On October 23, 2006, Judge Sim Lake sentenced Jeffrey Skilling to 24 years and 4 months in federal prison. The judge also ordered him to pay $45 million in restitution and forfeit another $180 million in assets. Skilling showed no emotion as the sentence was imposed. His family wept in the courtroom. He was led away in handcuffs to begin a prison term that would consume much of his remaining life. Skilling appealed his conviction, arguing that his trial had been unfair and that the jury instructions had been flawed. In 2009, an appeals court upheld most of his convictions but ordered him resentenced on one count. This led to a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for agreeing not to pursue further appeals, Skilling's sentence was reduced to 14 years. Additionally, he agreed to give up tens of millions of dollars that would be distributed to victims of the fraud. The Enron scandal reshaped American corporate governance. Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in 2002, imposing new requirements on corporate financial reporting and increasing penalties for fraud. CEOs and CFOs now had to personally certify the accuracy of financial statements. Audit committees were strengthened. Accounting firms faced new restrictions. The law was a direct response to Enron and other corporate scandals that had eroded public trust in financial markets. Arthur Andersen, Enron's auditor, became another casualty of the scandal. The accounting firm was convicted of obstruction of justice for shredding Enron-related documents. Though the conviction was later overturned by the Supreme Court, the damage was done. Andersen, once one of the Big Five accounting firms, effectively ceased operations. Thousands of Andersen employees lost their jobs, even though most had nothing to do with the Enron audit. Jeffrey Skilling served his sentence at multiple federal prisons. In prison, he met other high-profile white-collar criminals, including J. Rule and former New York State Comptroller Alan Hevesy. Skilling maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration. He gave occasional interviews claiming he had been wrongly convicted and that Enron had been a successful company destroyed by media hysteria and government overreach. Few people found his arguments persuasive. On February 21, 2019, after serving 12 years, Skilling was released from federal custody and transferred to a halfway house. He was finally freed later that year, having served about half his reduced sentence with credit for good behavior. He was 65 years old. The world he returned to had moved on from Enron, but the scandal remained a defining example of corporate malfeasance. Since his release, Skilling has kept a relatively low profile. He works as a consultant for a startup company in Houston, focusing on energy and technology. The company reportedly pays him a modest salary. He lives in Houston, the same city where Enron once dominated the skyline. The company's former headquarters building still stands downtown, a reminder of both the energy giant's ambitions and its spectacular collapse. For the victims of Enron's fraud, Skilling's release offered no satisfaction. Thousands of former employees never recovered their lost retirement savings. Many had invested their entire 401k accounts in Enron stock, following company encouragement and believing in management's reassurances. When the stock became worthless, their financial futures disappeared. Some had to delay retirement for years. Others never retired at all. The human cost of the fraud extended far beyond any dollar amount that could be calculated in bankruptcy proceedings. What made the Enron case stand out was not just the scale, but the nature of the deception. This wasn't a simple embezzlement scheme. Enron was a real company with actual operations. It employed thousands of people. It provided genuine services. The fraud lay in the systematic misrepresentation of the company's financial condition. Executives created an illusion of profitability while knowing the underlying businesses were struggling. They used accounting gimmicks and off-balance sheet entities to hide losses and manufacture earnings. Jeffrey Skilling was the architect of much of this deception. He championed the aggressive accounting policies. He approved the structures used to hide debt. He fostered the culture where results mattered more than honesty. And when the company began to collapse, he walked away, leaving others to face the consequences. His conviction and imprisonment sent a message that corporate executives could not hide behind complexity or claim ignorance of fraud happening under their leadership. The case also highlighted the dangers of corporate cultures that discourage dissent and reward short-term results above all else. Enron's rank and yank system created an environment where employees feared speaking up about problems. Executives who delivered impressive numbers were celebrated regardless of how those numbers were achieved. Analysts who questioned Enron's finances were dismissed or insulted. This culture of arrogance and intimidation enabled the fraud to continue for years. Enron became a byword for corporate corruption, used as a cautionary tale in business schools and boardrooms. The company's collapse demonstrated that even the most celebrated corporations could be built on lies. The smartest executives could convince themselves that rules didn't apply to them. The most sophisticated financial engineering could serve fraudulent purposes, and when the deception was finally exposed, the destruction was total. For Jeffrey Skilling, the years in prison and the permanent stain on his reputation were consequences of choices he made at the height of his power. He could have insisted on honest accounting. He could have halted the creation of deceptive structures. He could have prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term stock prices. Instead, he chose deception and paid the price. His story remains a reminder that intelligence and ambition without integrity lead not to lasting success, but to catastrophic failure and well-deserved punishment. Case 4. Elizabeth Holmes. Elizabeth Holmes wanted to change the world. At 19 years old, she dropped out of Stanford University to pursue a vision, a device that could run hundreds of medical tests from a single drop of blood taken from a finger prick. No more needles, no more vials, just a small sample and revolutionary technology that would democratize healthcare. By age 31, she had become the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. She graced the covers of Fortune, Forbes, and Inc. She wore black turtlenecks and spoke in an unnaturally deep voice, cultivating comparisons to Steve Jobs. But the technology she promoted didn't work. The tests were unreliable, and patients received inaccurate results that put their health at risk. Elizabeth Holmes was not a visionary. She was running an elaborate fraud. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born in Washington, D.C. in 1984. Her father worked for government agencies including USAID. Her mother was a congressional committee staffer. Holmes grew up in a family that valued achievement and had connections to power. She showed early interest in entrepreneurship and technology. At 9 years old, she told relatives she wanted to be a billionaire. While other children played, Holmes wrote detailed business plans and practiced computer programming. In 2002, Holmes enrolled at Stanford University to study chemical engineering. She was driven and ambitious, but also prone to grand claims. During the summer after her freshman year, she worked in a lab at the Genome Institute of Singapore. Upon returning to Stanford, she told her chemical engineering professor, Channing Robertson, that she had invented a patch that could scan for diseases and deliver medication. Robertson became her mentor and later joined the board of her company. In 2003, at age 19, Holmes dropped out of Stanford to found Real-Time Cures, which she soon renamed Theranos, a combination of therapy and diagnosis. Her pitch was compelling. Existing blood testing required drawing multiple vials of blood from patients' veins, a process that was painful, expensive, and time-consuming. Holmes proposed a device called the Edison that could run hundreds of tests from just a few drops of blood from a finger prick. The results would be faster and cheaper than traditional lab testing. For people with needle phobias or difficult venous access, the technology promised liberation. Holmes raised initial funding from family connections and venture capitalists impressed by her confidence and vision. She was articulate and charismatic, able to describe complex medical technology in accessible terms. She spoke about her fear of needles and her desire to help patients avoid unnecessary pain. The story was personal, compelling, and marketable. Investors believed they were backing the next great medical breakthrough. But from the beginning, the technology didn't work, as Holmes claimed. The Edison devices were finicky and unreliable. They could only run a handful of tests, not the hundreds Holmes advertised. The small blood samples often weren't sufficient for accurate results. Engineers working at Theranos struggled to make the devices function properly. They raised concerns. Holmes dismissed them. Rather than admit the technology wasn't ready, Holmes and her business partner, Ramesh Sunny Balwani, who later became her boyfriend and Theranos' president, chose deception. When the Edison devices couldn't produce accurate results, Theranos secretly ran tests on traditional blood testing machines purchased from other companies. They diluted the small finger prick samples and ran them through conventional analyzers, a process that often led to inaccurate results. Then they sent those results to patients and doctors who believed they came from Theranos' revolutionary technology. Holmes was obsessive about maintaining secrecy. Theranos operated in stealth mode for years, refusing to publish research in peer-reviewed journals or present data at medical conferences. Holmes claimed this was to protect trade secrets from competitors. The real reason was that scrutiny would expose the fact that the technology didn't work. Employees were required to sign strict non-disclosure agreements. The company was divided into siloed departments that couldn't communicate with each other. Workers who raised concerns about accuracy or safety were fired or threatened with legal action. Despite the secrecy, Holmes managed to attract extraordinary investment. By 2013 and 2014, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. Holmes owned about half the company, making her net worth roughly $4.5 billion on paper. Forbes named her the youngest self-made female billionaire. She cultivated a carefully crafted public image. She wore black turtlenecks identical to Steve Jobs' signature style. She spoke in an unusually deep voice that some associates later said was affected. She gave interviews describing her mission to democratize healthcare and her willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for her vision. The investor list read like a who's who of American wealth and power. Rupert Murdoch invested $125 million. The Walton family, heirs to the Walmart fortune, invested $150 million. Betsy DeVos's family invested $100 million. Larry Ellison put in money. The Cox family invested. These were sophisticated investors with access to due diligence resources. But Holmes's presentation was so convincing and the promise of the technology so appealing that they invested without adequate verification. Theranos also assembled an impressive board of directors. Former Secretaries of State George Shultz and Henry Kissinger joined. Former Defense Secretary James Mattis signed on. Former Senators Sam Nunn and Bill Frist became board members. The board was heavy on political connections and light on medical or scientific expertise. None of these board members had backgrounds that would allow them to evaluate whether the technology actually worked. Their names provided legitimacy and opened doors. Holmes used them as props. In 2013, Theranos partnered with Walgreens to offer blood tests in stores across Arizona and California. Patients could walk into a Walgreens, get a finger prick test, and receive results. Holmes portrayed this as democratizing healthcare by making testing accessible and affordable. What she didn't mention was that many of the tests weren't actually being run on Theranos devices. The company was using traditional machines and, in many cases, producing unreliable results. Patients received inaccurate test results that could have had serious medical consequences. Some received false positives for conditions they didn't have, leading to unnecessary stress and medical procedures. Others received false negatives that might have caused them to miss real health problems. The extent of the harm is difficult to quantify because Theranos has been reluctant to provide complete data. But prosecutors would later present evidence of patients who had been endangered by inaccurate results. In addition to defrauding investors and endangering patients, Holmes engaged in numerous acts of deception to maintain the illusion. She forged endorsement letters from pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and Schering-Plough, making it appear they had validated Theranos' technology. She lied about the military using Theranos devices on battlefields in Afghanistan. She told investors that Theranos would generate over $100 million in revenue in 2014, knowing the actual figure would be far less. She presented Secretary of Defense James Mattis with misleading information that led him to believe the technology worked as advertised, causing him to advocate for its use by the military. By 2015, Theranos was a Silicon Valley darling. Holmes had appeared on the cover of major magazines. She spoke at conferences and corporate events. She was profiled in fawning articles that described her as a visionary changing healthcare. Behind the scenes, employees who knew the truth were becoming increasingly concerned. Some left the company. A few became whistleblowers. Tyler Shultz, the grandson of former Secretary of State George Shultz, worked at Theranos as a research engineer. He observed firsthand that the test results were unreliable. When he raised concerns internally, he was dismissed and threatened. He left the company in 2014 and began speaking to regulatory authorities. Theranos hired lawyers and private investigators to intimidate him. His own grandfather, who sat on the Theranos board and was a close friend of Holmes, sided with the company against him. The pressure on Tyler Shultz was immense, but he persisted. On October 15, 2015, Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou published a devastating investigation. The article revealed that Theranos was secretly using traditional blood testing equipment for most of its tests, that the Edison devices were unreliable, and that the company had misled investors and patients. Holmes immediately went on the offensive. She appeared on television calling the article false and attacking Carreyrou's credibility. She had supporters who rallied to her defense. But more whistleblowers came forward. More evidence emerged. The facade began to crumble. Regulatory agencies launched investigations. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services inspected Theranos' laboratory and found major deficiencies. In 2016, CMS revoked the license for Theranos' Newark, California lab and banned Holmes from owning or operating a lab for 2 years. Walgreens ended its partnership with Theranos. The Theranos board began asking hard questions. Investors who had believed in Holmes started demanding answers. In March 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged Holmes with fraud. She settled the charges without admitting wrongdoing, agreeing to give up control of Theranos, pay a $500,000 fine, and accept a ban on serving as an officer or director of a public company for 10 years. But the SEC case was just the beginning. Federal prosecutors in San Francisco had opened a criminal investigation. On June 15, 2018, federal prosecutors indicted Elizabeth Holmes and Ramesh Balwani on charges of wire fraud and conspiracy. The indictment alleged they had knowingly defrauded investors and endangered patients with false claims about Theranos' technology. Holmes pleaded not guilty. She assembled a high-powered legal defense team. The case would take years to come to trial. The trial of Elizabeth Holmes began on September 8, 2021, in federal court in San Jose, California. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of fraud. They showed emails where Holmes made claims she knew were false. They presented testimony from investors who had been deceived. They brought forward patients who had received inaccurate test results. The case seemed strong. But Holmes's defense strategy was unexpected. Her lawyers argued that she had been in an abusive relationship with Ramesh Balwani, who was 19 years older. They claimed Balwani had controlled many aspects of her life, including how she dressed, spoke, and ate. They suggested she had been psychologically manipulated and that Balwani bore primary responsibility for the fraud. Holmes testified in her own defense, describing the alleged abuse and claiming she had believed the technology would eventually work. The abuse allegations complicated the case. If proven, they might have provided some mitigation. But prosecutors argued that Holmes had been the CEO and founder, the person who made the ultimate decisions and who personally deceived investors and patients. They noted that much of the fraud occurred before Balwani joined Theranos. The jury would have to decide whether Holmes was a victim or a perpetrator. On January 3, 2022, after 7 days of deliberation, the jury convicted Holmes on 4 counts. 1 count of conspiracy to defraud investors and 3 counts of wire fraud against specific investors. She was acquitted on charges related to defrauding patients and on some of the investor fraud counts. The verdict was a mixed outcome, but Holmes faced decades in prison. Throughout the trial and sentencing process, Holmes's personal life drew attention. She had married William "Billy" Evans, an heir to a hotel fortune, in 2019. She gave birth to their first child in July 2021, just before her trial began. She became pregnant again during the trial, giving birth to their second child in early 2023. Some observers viewed the timing as strategic, an attempt to generate sympathy and possibly delay incarceration. The sentencing hearing in November 2022 was emotional. Holmes's family and friends submitted letters describing her as a caring person who made mistakes but deserved leniency. Her attorneys argued she should receive a light sentence or home confinement, emphasizing her role as a mother of young children. Prosecutors countered that Holmes had shown no genuine remorse and had endangered patients for profit. Victims testified about the harm caused by her fraud. Judge Edward Davila presided over the sentencing. He acknowledged that Holmes was brilliant, but noted that her brilliance had been used for deception. He pointed to the scale of the fraud and the lack of genuine remorse. He observed that Holmes had been motivated by ambition and greed, not by a sincere desire to help patients. On November 18, 2022, Judge Davila sentenced Elizabeth Holmes to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He also ordered her to pay $452 million in restitution to investors, jointly with Balwani. Holmes attempted to delay reporting to prison while appealing her conviction. The appeals court denied her request. On May 30, 2023, Elizabeth Holmes surrendered at the federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas, a minimum security facility for women located about 100 miles northwest of Houston. She left behind her 2 young children, who were 21 months old and 3 months old at the time. The image of Holmes arriving at prison wearing a tan cardigan, accompanied by her parents and husband, drew significant media coverage. The Bryan facility houses approximately 700 women in an environment that, by prison standards, is relatively comfortable. Inmates live in dormitories rather than cells, have access to recreation facilities and educational programs, and can receive family visits. Holmes will be eligible for release in December 2032, with good behavior credits potentially shortening her sentence by about 2 years. She will be 48 years old when she walks free. Ramesh Balwani, Holmes's former boyfriend and business partner, was tried separately. In July 2022, he was convicted on all 12 counts of fraud and conspiracy. In December 2022, he was sentenced to 12 years and 11 months in prison, a slightly longer sentence than Holmes received. The judge in Balwani's case noted his extensive business experience and found he bore significant responsibility for the fraud. The Theranos scandal had far-reaching consequences beyond the courtroom. The company officially dissolved in September 2018. Investors lost nearly 1 billion patients who received inaccurate test results, faced ongoing health concerns and loss of trust in medical testing. The case became a cautionary tale about Silicon Valley's fake-it-till-you-make-it culture, where founders are encouraged to exaggerate progress and promise revolutionary breakthroughs even when the technology isn't ready. The scandal also highlighted the dangers of celebrity entrepreneurship. Holmes had been treated as a visionary largely because of her narrative and presentation, not because of verified scientific achievements. Magazine covers and conference appearances created an aura of success that substituted for actual evidence. Investors, board members, and business partners accepted her claims without adequate verification because they wanted to believe in the story she was selling. What makes the case stand out was that this wasn't just financial fraud. Holmes's deception endangered patients. People received inaccurate medical test results that could have led to misdiagnosis, unnecessary treatment, or failure to detect real health problems. The fraud took place in healthcare, where accuracy matters in ways that financial fraud doesn't. A wrong stock valuation hurts investors. A wrong medical test can cost lives. Judge Davila addressed this in his sentencing remarks. He noted that Holmes had been motivated by fame and fortune, that she had pursued a lifestyle of private jets and luxury accommodations while building a company on lies. He observed that her fraud demonstrated the tragedy of misusing brilliance for deception rather than genuine innovation. And he concluded that despite her 2 young children, despite letters from family and friends, the seriousness of the crimes warranted a lengthy prison sentence. From prison, Holmes has maintained her innocence in certain respects. In a 2025 interview with People magazine, she stated, "I refuse to plead guilty to crimes I did not commit. Theranos failed, but failure is not fraud." The statement encapsulated her continued inability to fully accept responsibility. The jury, the judge, and the evidence said otherwise. Theranos didn't just fail. It was built on deliberate deception from the beginning. For Silicon Valley, the Holmes case shattered certain illusions. The industry had celebrated her as proof that young founders could revolutionize entire sectors. Her downfall demonstrated that revolutionary claims require revolutionary evidence. The case led to increased scrutiny of health technology startups. Investors became more careful about due diligence. The era of accepting bold claims without verification began to wane. Elizabeth Holmes will spend her 40s in federal prison, her children growing up largely without her, her fortune gone, her reputation destroyed. The woman who once graced magazine covers as a visionary now serves as a warning about the consequences of fraud. Her story is taught in business schools as an example of what not to do. Her black turtlenecks and deep voice became punchlines rather than symbols of innovation. For the patients who received inaccurate test results, for the investors who lost nearly $1 billion, for the employees whose careers were damaged by association with the fraud, Elizabeth Holmes's imprisonment offers some accountability. But it cannot undo the harm. The false diagnoses cannot be taken back. The wasted investments cannot be recovered. And the lesson her case provides, that brilliant founders can be running elaborate frauds, that disruption rhetoric can mask deception, and that Silicon Valley's culture of hype can enable serious crimes, remains relevant years after Theranos collapsed. Case 5. Bernard Ebbers. Bernard Ebbers was a self-made success story. He had delivered milk, worked as a high school basketball coach, and owned a chain of budget motels before entering the telecommunications business. Through aggressive acquisitions and force of personality, he built WorldCom from a small long-distance provider into the second-largest telecommunications company in America. At its peak, WorldCom handled half the Internet's traffic and employed more than 80,000 people. Ebbers became a billionaire and a hero in his adopted home state of Mississippi. But when the telecommunications boom ended, Ebbers faced a choice: admit that WorldCom was struggling or hide the problems and hope they resolved themselves. He chose deception. The result was an $11 billion accounting fraud that destroyed the company and devastated thousands of lives. Bernard John Ebbers was born in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, in 1941. His family moved to California when he was young, then to New Mexico. Ebbers was not a natural businessman or technology expert. He studied physical education at Mississippi College on a basketball scholarship. After graduating, he worked as a high school basketball coach and physical education teacher. The job didn't pay well and didn't satisfy his ambitions. In the 1970s, Ebbers began buying and operating budget motels in Mississippi and Texas. He had a knack for making failing properties profitable through hands-on management and cost-cutting. By the early 1980s, he owned a small chain of motels and had made enough money to consider other opportunities. When a friend approached him about investing in a long-distance telephone company, Ebbers was intrigued. In 1983, Ebbers and several partners founded long-distance discount services, which they soon renamed LDDS Communications. The timing was fortunate. The breakup of AT&T's monopoly in 1984 created opportunities for new competitors in long-distance service. LDDS was small and regional, but Ebbers saw potential for growth through acquisition. He began buying other small telecommunications companies, consolidating operations and cutting costs. Ebbers' strategy was simple: acquire companies, slash expenses, and use the savings to fund more acquisitions. He was ruthless about cutting costs and demanded absolute loyalty from employees. He ruled through intimidation and force of personality. Ebbers stood 6'4", spoke in a booming voice, and had little patience for disagreement. Executives who questioned his decisions were marginalized or pushed out. Throughout the 1990s, LDDS went on an acquisition spree. In 1995, the company bought Williams Telecommunications and changed its name to WorldCom. In 1996, WorldCom acquired MFS Communications for $14 billion, its largest purchase yet. The MFS deal also gave WorldCom control of UUNet, a major internet backbone provider. Suddenly, WorldCom was positioned at the center of the internet boom. In 1998, WorldCom announced its most audacious acquisition, a $37 billion merger with MCI Communications, then the second-largest long-distance carrier. The deal made WorldCom a telecommunications powerhouse with operations across the United States and around the world. Ebbers was hailed as a visionary. WorldCom's stock price soared. On paper, Ebbers was worth billions. But the acquisition strategy had hidden weaknesses. WorldCom was accumulating massive debt to fund its purchases. The company had to generate enormous amounts of cash to service that debt. And integrating dozens of acquired companies proved far more difficult than Ebbers had anticipated. Different systems had to be merged. Redundant operations had to be eliminated. Cultural clashes had to be managed. WorldCom was a patchwork of acquired companies held together by Ebbers' will and the promise of continued growth. In 2000, Ebbers attempted his biggest acquisition yet, a $129 billion merger with Sprint Corporation. The deal would have created a telecommunications colossus. But federal regulators blocked the merger on antitrust grounds. The failure was devastating for WorldCom. The company's stock price, which had been buoyed by acquisition momentum, began to fall. Investors who had bought into the growth story started to worry that WorldCom couldn't deliver without continuing to acquire companies. The collapse of the dot-com bubble made things worse. Telecommunications companies had massively overbuilt capacity during the boom, laying fiber optic cables that went largely unused. Prices for long-distance service plummeted as supply far exceeded demand. WorldCom's revenues began to decline. The company that had been built on promises of endless growth suddenly faced a shrinking market. Ebbers had a personal financial problem that compounded the company's troubles. He had borrowed approximately $400 million from banks, using his WorldCom stock as collateral. When WorldCom's stock price fell, the banks demanded additional collateral or repayment. Ebers didn't have the cash. He asked WorldCom's board of directors for help. The board agreed to loan him more than $400 million at favorable interest rates. It was an extraordinary arrangement that raised questions about corporate governance and conflicts of interest. As WorldCom's business deteriorated, Ebers and his chief financial officer, Scott Sullivan, faced mounting pressure to meet Wall Street's expectations. Analysts expected WorldCom to report steady growth. Missing those expectations would cause the stock price to fall further, potentially triggering margin calls on Ebers's loans. Rather than report the truth about WorldCom's declining performance, Sullivan and his accounting team began manipulating the company's financial statements. The fraud was systematic and brazen. WorldCom inflated revenues by recording bogus income. The company hid expenses by improperly capitalizing costs that should have been expensed immediately. Sullivan and his team reclassified billions in ordinary operating expenses as capital expenditures, which could be depreciated over years rather than recognized immediately. This simple accounting trick made WorldCom's profits appear far larger than they actually were. The fraud accelerated as WorldCom's actual performance worsened. In 2001 alone, WorldCom improperly capitalized approximately $3.8 billion in line costs. By the time the fraud was discovered, the company had inflated its earnings by approximately $11 billion. The scale was staggering. This wasn't a one-time manipulation or a borderline accounting decision. It was systematic, sustained fraud designed to deceive investors and regulators about WorldCom's true financial condition. Ebers maintained later that he didn't understand the technical details of the accounting fraud. He claimed he relied on Sullivan and other financial executives to handle the numbers. But prosecutors would argue that Ebers knew WorldCom was struggling and had personally pressured executives to meet earnings targets. Whether Ebers understood the specific accounting entries or not, he created the environment where fraud became the solution to declining performance. The fraud began to unravel in early 2002. As WorldCom's financial condition continued to deteriorate, Ebers came under increasing pressure from the board of directors. On April 30, 2002, the board forced Ebers to resign as CEO. He left with a severance package worth tens of millions of dollars. John Sidgmore, WorldCom's vice chairman, took over as CEO. Sidgmore inherited a disaster. WorldCom's stock price had fallen from more than $60 per share at its peak to less than $2. The company was drowning in debt. Revenues continued to decline. But Sidgmore didn't yet know about the accounting fraud. That revelation would come from an unexpected source, WorldCom's internal audit department. Cynthia Cooper, WorldCom's vice president of internal audit, had noticed irregularities in the company's accounting. When she asked questions, she received evasive answers. Rather than drop the matter, Cooper and her small team began investigating after hours, examining financial records and questioning employees. What they discovered shocked them. Billions of dollars in expenses had been improperly capitalized. The company's reported profits were fiction. On June 25, 2002, WorldCom announced it had discovered accounting irregularities totaling $3.8 billion. The revelation sent shockwaves through the financial markets. WorldCom's stock price collapsed. Credit rating agencies downgraded the company's debt to junk status. Business partners backed away. The company that had been the darling of the telecommunications industry was now a pariah. Within weeks, the extent of the fraud became clearer. WorldCom continued to discover additional accounting improprieties. The total eventually reached approximately $11 billion. On July 21, 2002, WorldCom filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. At the time, it was the largest bankruptcy in American history, surpassing even Enron, which had filed just 7 months earlier. WorldCom listed $107 billion in assets, making the collapse unprecedented in scale. The bankruptcy devastated WorldCom's employees. The company began massive layoffs. Ultimately, more than 30,000 people lost their jobs. Many had their retirement savings invested in WorldCom stock, following the company's encouragement and believing in Ebers's leadership. When the stock became worthless, their financial futures disappeared. Some employees lost six-figure retirement accounts. Workers in their 50s and 60s, who should have been preparing for retirement, found themselves with nothing. Federal investigators immediately launched a criminal probe. The scale of the fraud was enormous, and prosecutors were determined to hold those responsible accountable. In March 2004, Bernard Ebers was indicted on 9 felony counts, including securities fraud, conspiracy, and filing false documents. Scott Sullivan, the CFO who had directed the accounting manipulations, had already pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Ebers maintained his innocence. He claimed he had known nothing about the accounting fraud. He portrayed himself as a visionary businessman focused on strategy and growth, not on accounting details. He insisted that Sullivan and other financial executives had acted without his knowledge or approval. His defense rested on the argument that being CEO of a failing company was not a crime. Only deliberate fraud was criminal, and Ebers claimed he had never knowingly participated in fraud. The trial began on January 26, 2005, in federal court in Manhattan. Prosecutors presented testimony from 5 former WorldCom executives who had pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate. Scott Sullivan was the key witness. He testified that Ebers had known about the accounting fraud and had personally pressured executives to meet earnings targets. Sullivan described meetings where Ebers had made clear that the company needed to meet Wall Street's expectations, whatever it took. Other witnesses described Ebers's management style. He was deeply involved in WorldCom's operations. He demanded detailed reports on the company's performance. He knew when revenues were declining and expenses were rising. Prosecutors argued that it was implausible that Ebers, who micromanaged so many aspects of WorldCom's business, knew nothing about an $11 billion accounting fraud. Ebers did not testify in his own defense. His lawyers argued that the government's case relied on the testimony of admitted criminals trying to reduce their own sentences by implicating Ebers. They portrayed Ebers as a businessman, not an accountant, who had relied on experts to handle the financial reporting. They suggested that Sullivan and other executives had deceived Ebers just as they had deceived investors. On March 15, 2005, after 8 days of deliberation, the jury convicted Bernard Ebers on all 9 counts. He showed no reaction as the verdict was read. His daughter wept in the courtroom. Ebers was released on $10 million bail while awaiting sentencing. He returned to his Mississippi estate, a sprawling property that included a farm and a lake, to await his fate. The sentencing hearing took place on July 13, 2005. Victims testified about losing their jobs and retirement savings. Former employees described the devastation when WorldCom collapsed and their life's work disappeared. Ebers's attorneys asked for leniency, noting his age and his lack of criminal history. They argued that a lengthy sentence would amount to a life sentence for a man in his 60s. Judge Barbara Jones was unmoved. She noted the extraordinary scale of the fraud and the harm it had caused. She observed that Ebers had not shown genuine remorse or accepted responsibility for his actions. On July 13, 2005, Judge Jones sentenced Bernard Ebers to 25 years in federal prison. At 63 years old, Ebers faced the probability of dying behind bars. Ebers appealed his conviction, arguing that errors in the trial had denied him a fair hearing. In 2006, an appeals court rejected his arguments and upheld the conviction and sentence. Ebers's legal options were exhausted. In September 2006, he reported to the Federal Correctional Institution in Oakdale, Louisiana, to begin serving his sentence. The man who had once controlled a telecommunications empire became federal inmate number 562254. Life in prison was a dramatic come-down for Ebers. He worked menial jobs for pennies an hour. He followed the same rules as every other prisoner. His wealth, his status, his connections, none of it mattered behind bars. Ebers maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration. He gave occasional interviews claiming he had been wrongly convicted. Few people found his claims credible, given the evidence presented at trial. While Ebers served his sentence, WorldCom continued through bankruptcy reorganization. The company emerged from bankruptcy in 2004 as MCI, shedding billions in debt and most of its obligations to creditors and former employees. In 2006, Verizon Communications acquired MCI for $7.6 billion. The WorldCom name disappeared. The company that Ebers had built ceased to exist as an independent entity. By the late 2010s, Ebers's health was deteriorating. He suffered from heart problems and dementia. His family and attorneys petitioned for compassionate release, arguing that he was no longer a danger to society and that prison medical facilities could not adequately care for him. Prosecutors initially opposed the request, but eventually agreed, given the severity of his condition. On December 18, 2019, Judge Jones granted Bernard Ebers compassionate release after he had served approximately 13 years of his 25-year sentence. Ebers, now 78 years old and suffering from advanced dementia, was released to his family in Mississippi. He was frail and barely recognized people. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and built a telecommunications empire was a shadow of his former self. Bernard Ebers died on February 2, 2020, less than 2 months after his release. He was 78 years old. His death drew limited media coverage. The world had moved on from WorldCom. Younger people barely remembered the company or the scandal. But for those who had lost their jobs and savings when WorldCom collapsed, Ebers's death was a reminder of the devastation he had caused. The WorldCom scandal, along with Enron and other corporate frauds of the early 2000s, led to significant reforms in corporate governance and financial reporting. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 imposed new requirements on public companies to prevent accounting fraud. CEOs and CFOs had to personally certify financial statements. Audit committees were strengthened. Penalties for fraud were increased. The reforms were direct responses to WorldCom and Enron. What made the WorldCom case stand out was not just the scale, but the human cost. This wasn't an abstract financial manipulation. Over 30,000 people lost their jobs. Thousands more lost their retirement savings. Communities where WorldCom operated were devastated by the layoffs. The company's collapse rippled through the telecommunications industry, contributing to a broader downturn that cost tens of thousands of additional jobs across the sector. Bernard Ebers's story illustrated how business failure and crime are distinct. WorldCom's business model was problematic. The company had overextended itself through acquisitions. The telecommunications market had changed in ways that made WorldCom's strategy obsolete. If Ebers had acknowledged these problems and worked to restructure the company, he might have presided over a difficult but legal restructuring. Instead, he and his executives chose fraud, hiding the problems, and lying to investors and employees. The choice to commit fraud rather than admit failure stemmed partly from Ebers's personality. He had built his identity around being a successful businessman. Admitting that WorldCom was struggling would have required admitting that his strategy had failed. His personal financial situation, with hundreds of millions borrowed against falling WorldCom stock, created additional pressure. And the culture he had created at WorldCom, where meeting targets mattered more than how those targets were achieved, made fraud seem like a solution rather than a crime. For the employees who lost everything when WorldCom collapsed, Ebers's eventual imprisonment and death offered limited satisfaction. No prison sentence could restore their lost retirement savings or give back the years they had devoted to building a company based on lies. The damage was permanent. But Ebers's conviction and lengthy sentence sent a message that CEOs who presided over massive frauds would face serious consequences, regardless of their background or status. Bernard Ebers had risen from delivering milk to commanding a telecommunications giant. His fall from corporate titan to federal prisoner was equally dramatic. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of growth at any cost strategies, about the temptation to hide problems rather than address them, and about how personal financial pressures can drive even successful executives to commit massive fraud. His legacy is not the telecommunications company he built, but the $11 billion fraud that destroyed it and the thousands of lives devastated in the wreckage. Case 6. Alan Stanford. Alan Stanford lived like royalty. He owned a fleet of private jets. He maintained mansions in multiple countries. He sponsored international cricket tournaments with his name plastered across stadiums. The government of Antigua and Barbuda knighted him for his contributions to the island nation's economy. He claimed to be descended from Leland Stanford, the railroad baron who founded Stanford University. He presented himself as a brilliant financier who had unlocked the secret to consistent high returns. But Alan Stanford was running one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history. From his Caribbean banking empire, he defrauded over 18,000 investors from 113 countries of approximately $7 billion. When the fraud finally collapsed, it devastated not just individual victims, but an entire nation's economy. Robert Allen Stanford was born in Mexia, Texas in 1950. His family had modest means. His father was a barber. Stanford's claims of descending from Leland Stanford were false, though he repeated the story so often that many people believed it. After graduating from Baylor University, Stanford worked in real estate and fitness businesses with limited success. He had ambitions far beyond his circumstances and a willingness to bend rules to achieve them. In the 1980s, Stanford got into trouble with Texas banking regulators. In 1986, he settled charges related to illegal banking activities, agreeing to stop operating a certificate of deposit program that regulators deemed improper. Rather than abandon offshore banking, Stanford simply moved his operations outside U.S. jurisdiction. In 1986, he purchased a bank on the Caribbean island of Montserrat. When a hurricane devastated Montserrat in the 1990s, Stanford moved the bank to Antigua and Barbuda. Stanford International Bank became the centerpiece of Stanford's financial empire. Located in Antigua, beyond the reach of U.S. banking regulators, the bank sold certificates of deposit to investors around the world. Stanford promised returns that were consistently higher than those offered by U.S. banks. The bank's marketing materials suggested it achieved these returns through a diversified portfolio of safe investments managed by sophisticated analysts. The truth was far different. Stanford International Bank was essentially a fraud. The bank took in money from new investors and used it to pay existing investors who wanted to cash out. This is the classic structure of a Ponzi scheme. The bank did hold some legitimate investments, but nowhere near the amounts claimed in its financial statements. Much of the money was spent on Stanford's lavish lifestyle, on bribes to Antiguan officials, and on his other business ventures, including cricket sponsorship and real estate development. Stanford cultivated an image of legitimate wealth and respectability. He sponsored cricket extensively, particularly in the Caribbean, where the sport is hugely popular. In 2008, he organized the Stanford 2020, a cricket tournament offering a $20 million prize, the largest in cricket history. He arrived at matches by helicopter. His name appeared on stadiums and team uniforms. Cricket legends praised him for his generosity to the sport. The sponsorship gave Stanford credibility and visibility, making his bank seem more legitimate. In Antigua, Stanford was treated like a hero. He was the largest private employer on the island, with approximately 1,000 workers. He sponsored local charities and community events. He invested in real estate development projects. In 2006, the Antiguan government knighted him, making him Sir Alan Stanford. The knighthood was both recognition of his economic contributions and a result of his political connections. Stanford had cultivated relationships with Antiguan officials, relationships that would later be revealed to involve substantial bribes. Stanford's business model depended on constant new deposits. As long as more money came in than went out, he could continue paying existing investors their promised returns and funding his lifestyle. But this meant Stanford needed aggressive marketing. The Stanford Financial Group, headquartered in Houston, employed a large sales force to sell the Antiguan bank's certificates of deposit. Many of these financial advisors believed they were selling legitimate investment products. They had been trained to present Stanford International Bank as a safe, profitable investment. The sales pitch was compelling. Stanford International Bank's certificates of deposit offered interest rates several points higher than U.S. banks. The bank's marketing materials claimed it had achieved consistently positive returns even during market downturns. Financial statements showed a diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, real estate, and alternative investments. The bank was supposedly managed by a team of expert analysts who carefully monitored global markets. For investors seeking safety with higher returns than U.S. banks offered, Stanford's CDs seemed ideal. Warning signs were present for those who looked closely. Financial advisor Harry Markopoulos, who had exposed Bernie Madoff's fraud, also warned regulators about Stanford. In 2008, he reported that Stanford's returns were too consistent and that the offshore structure avoided proper oversight. Venezuelan regulators had examined Stanford International Bank and found irregularities, leading them to shut down Stanford's operations in Venezuela. These warnings reached U.S. regulators but did not initially trigger decisive action. The 2008 financial crisis created problems for Stanford. As markets collapsed, some investors wanted to withdraw their money. The redemption requests increased. At the same time, new deposits slowed as the global economy contracted and investors became more cautious. The math of the Ponzi scheme no longer worked. Stanford needed more money coming in than going out, but the trend was reversing. The Securities and Exchange Commission had been investigating Stanford for years, but had not moved aggressively. In February 2009, finally convinced they had sufficient evidence, SEC investigators descended on Stanford Financial Group's Houston offices. On February 17, 2009, the SEC filed civil fraud charges against Alan Stanford, alleging he had orchestrated a massive Ponzi scheme through fraudulent certificates of deposit. The civil charges were just the beginning. Federal prosecutors in Houston opened a criminal investigation. The FBI became involved. On February 27, 2009, agents served Stanford with the SEC's complaint at the home of his girlfriend's parents in Virginia. Stanford did not go quietly. He claimed the charges were false and that his bank was solvent. He insisted that regulators were destroying a legitimate business because they didn't understand offshore banking. Within days, Stanford's empire collapsed. Regulators froze Stanford International Bank's assets. Investors rushed to withdraw their money and discovered they couldn't. The bank didn't have the assets it claimed. Most of the $7 billion in certificates of deposit had been spent or lost. Approximately 18,000 investors, many of them retirees who had put their life savings into Stanford CDs, faced devastating losses. The impact in Antigua was catastrophic. Stanford International Bank had employed approximately 1,000 people on an island with a population of 85,000. Overnight, those jobs disappeared. Stanford's real estate projects halted. His charitable contributions stopped. The Antiguan economy, which had become dependent on Stanford's operations, went into crisis. The government faced a fiscal emergency. The man who had been knighted as a benefactor was now exposed as a fraud who had exploited the island for his criminal enterprise. Stanford fled. He moved between countries trying to stay ahead of authorities. He withdrew large amounts of cash. He attempted to move assets beyond the reach of investigators. But on June 18, 2009, FBI agents arrested Stanford in Virginia. He was charged with multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He was denied bail and sent to jail to await trial. While in custody, Stanford got into an altercation with another inmate and suffered serious injuries. He was beaten badly enough to require hospitalization. The attack left him with lasting injuries, including memory problems that his defense attorneys would later claim affected his ability to assist in his own defense. Whether the attack was random violence or related to his fraud was never definitively established. Stanford's trial was delayed multiple times. His attorneys argued he was not competent to stand trial due to injuries from the jail attack and addiction to anxiety medications. Prosecutors maintained he was feigning incompetence to avoid trial. After psychiatric evaluations, a judge ruled Stanford was competent to proceed. The trial finally began on January 24, 2012, in federal court in Houston. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of fraud. They showed that Stanford International Bank's financial statements were fiction. The diversified portfolio of safe investments didn't exist. The bank had lost billions on speculative real estate investments and bad loans, many of which went to Stanford's other companies. The promised returns were paid not from investment gains, but from new investors' deposits. Witnesses testified about the lavish lifestyle Stanford led using investor money. The prosecution brought victims to testify. Retirees described losing their entire life savings. One woman testified about investing $600,000, her family's nest egg, and losing everything. A man described how he had trusted Stanford's financial advisors and now faced poverty in his old age. The human cost of the fraud became visceral in the courtroom. Stanford's defense was that he had believed his business was legitimate. His attorneys argued that poor management and bad investments were not crimes. They suggested Stanford had been too trusting of advisors who had deceived him. They claimed the government was criminalizing business failure. The defense was not persuasive. The evidence showed Stanford had known about and directed the fraud, not been victimized by subordinates. On March 6, 2012, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury convicted Alan Stanford on 13 of 14 counts, including wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction. He was acquitted on one wire fraud count. Stanford showed little reaction to the verdict. He had maintained throughout the trial that he was innocent and seemed unable or unwilling to accept the reality of his crimes. The sentencing hearing took place on June 14, 2012. Victims again testified about the devastation Stanford's fraud had caused. A Jamaican pastor described how Stanford's collapse had destroyed his church's building fund. A Venezuelan investor spoke of losing $2 million that represented his family's security. An American retiree explained how she now worked part-time at 70 years old because Stanford had stolen her retirement savings. Stanford addressed the court, maintaining his innocence and claiming he was the victim of a government conspiracy. He showed no remorse and no acceptance of responsibility. U.S. District Judge David Hittner was scathing in his response. He noted Stanford's complete lack of remorse and the staggering harm he had caused. On June 14, 2012, Judge Hittner sentenced Alan Stanford to 110 years in federal prison. At 62 years old, Stanford would die in prison. The sentence reflected both the scale of the fraud and Stanford's attitude. The 110-year term was essentially symbolic. Stanford would never live long enough to serve it, but it sent a message about the seriousness of his crimes. Judge Hittner also ordered Stanford to forfeit $5.9 billion, though recovering that amount proved largely impossible, as most of the money was gone. Following his conviction, the government of Antigua and Barbuda stripped Stanford of his knighthood. The honor that had been granted for his supposed contributions to the island was revoked. Stanford went from Sir Alan to federal inmate number 3517183. He was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution in Coleman, Florida, a medium-security prison where he remains today. The receiver appointed to recover assets for Stanford's victims faced a daunting task. Most of the $7 billion was gone, spent on Stanford's lifestyle, lost in bad investments, or paid out to early investors. The receiver has managed to recover approximately $500 million, a fraction of the losses. Most victims will never recover more than cents on the dollar. The international scope of the fraud made recovery even more difficult. Victims were scattered across 113 countries. Some lived in the United States and Caribbean, but others were in South America, Europe, and elsewhere. Coordinating compensation across different legal jurisdictions has been complex and slow. Many victims, particularly older investors who needed the money for retirement, have died while waiting for partial restitution. The Stanford case exposed weaknesses in international financial regulation. Stanford International Bank operated in Antigua, outside U.S. regulatory authority, but sold investments to U.S. citizens. Antiguan regulators either didn't properly oversee the bank or were corrupted by Stanford's bribes. The offshore structure created a regulatory vacuum that Stanford exploited. The case demonstrated the need for better international cooperation in financial oversight. Evidence that emerged during the trial revealed Stanford had paid substantial bribes to Antiguan officials. He had given government officials loans that were never expected to be repaid, tickets to sporting events, and other benefits. In return, he received favorable treatment from regulators and political support. Some Antiguan officials were later criminally charged for their roles in enabling Stanford's fraud. From prison, Stanford has continued to maintain his innocence. He has given interviews claiming he was a legitimate businessman persecuted by overzealous prosecutors. He has appealed his conviction multiple times, arguing that he did not receive a fair trial. All his appeals have been rejected. The evidence of his guilt was overwhelming, and the courts have consistently found that his trial was fair. Stanford's fall from prominence was dramatic. He had lived as a billionaire, traveled by private jet, entertained celebrities and athletes, and been knighted by a foreign government. Now he lives in a prison cell, his fortune gone, his reputation destroyed, his freedom permanently lost. He is serving what amounts to a life sentence without possibility of parole. He will die in federal custody. For his victims, Stanford's imprisonment offers little comfort. A 75-year-old retiree who lost her life savings to Stanford's fraud doesn't benefit from knowing he's in prison. She's still working part-time jobs to survive. A family in Venezuela that lost everything in the collapse still struggles financially. Knowing Stanford is incarcerated doesn't restore their losses. The Stanford International Bank fraud was the second-largest Ponzi scheme in U.S. history, exceeded only by Bernie Madoff's $65 billion fraud. But while Madoff's victims were primarily in the United States, Stanford's victims were scattered across the globe. The international dimension added complexity to both the prosecution and the recovery efforts. It also highlighted how modern financial fraud can transcend borders in ways that regulatory structures haven't adapted to address. What makes the case stand out was how Stanford used legitimacy and respectability to enable fraud. The cricket sponsorship, the knighthood, the claims of blue blood ancestry, all of it was designed to make Stanford seem trustworthy and his bank legitimate. He weaponized charitable work and sports sponsorship to create a facade that concealed massive theft. His willingness to corrupt foreign officials and exploit a small island nation for his criminal enterprise demonstrated sociopathic disregard for the harm he caused. The Antiguan people were victims too. They had celebrated Stanford as a benefactor, bringing prosperity to their island. When his fraud was exposed, they lost not just jobs, but trust in their own government and financial system. The economic damage to Antigua took years to repair. The island's reputation as a financial center was severely damaged. The knighthood that had honored Stanford became a symbol of the island's failure to properly oversee foreign investors. Alan Stanford's story is a reminder that fraud can hide behind impressive credentials and international glamour. His claims of distinguished ancestry, his knighthood, his cricket sponsorship, his offshore banking structure, all of it created an illusion of sophisticated wealth management. The reality was far simpler and more sordid. Stanford was running a Ponzi scheme, stealing from investors to fund his lifestyle and pay earlier investors. The complexity was camouflage, not sophistication. Today, Alan Stanford remains in federal prison in Florida. He is now in his 70s. He will never be released. He will die as inmate number 350 Wasafimant 183, his once lavish lifestyle reduced to a prison cell and institutional routine. His victims remained scattered across the world, most having recovered little or nothing of their losses. His legacy is not the cricket tournaments or the development projects, but the $7 billion fraud that destroyed thousands of lives and an island nation's economy. The case stands as a warning about the dangers of offshore banking, the importance of international regulatory cooperation, and the reality that even knighted billionaires can be running massive criminal enterprises. Case 7. Dennis Kozlowski. The video was shocking in its excess. On a Mediterranean island under a canopy of lights, an ice sculpture of Michelangelo's David urinated Stolichnaya vodka into crystal glasses. Jimmy Buffett performed a private concert. Toga-clad waiters served elaborate meals. The birthday party for Dennis Kozlowski's wife cost $2 million and Tyco International paid half the bill. The party, disguised as a shareholder meeting, became the defining symbol of corporate excess in the early 2000s. But the Sardinia celebration was just one example of how Kozlowski had turned Tyco into his personal treasury. Over 5 years, he had taken $600 million in unauthorized bonuses and charged personal expenses to the company. His $30 million Manhattan apartment, paid for with Tyco funds, featured $6,000 shower curtains and a $15,000 umbrella stand. When prosecutors finally exposed the theft, Kozlowski's fall from corporate titan to convicted felon would become one of the most dramatic in American business history. Leo Dennis Kozlowski was born in Newark, New Jersey in 1946. His mother worked for the Newark Police Department. His father worked for public utilities. The family was working class, and Kozlowski grew up understanding the value of money and the necessity of hard work. He attended Seton Hall University, graduating in 1968, then earned an MBA. Unlike many corporate executives of his generation, Kozlowski didn't come from privilege. He built his career through competence and ambition. In 1975, Kozlowski joined Tyco International as an auditor. Tyco was a small manufacturing conglomerate based in New Hampshire. Kozlowski was smart, driven, and willing to work long hours. He understood the company's operations and financial systems intimately. He rose steadily through the ranks, taking on increasing responsibility. In 1992, he was named CEO. Under his leadership, Tyco would transform from a modest manufacturer into a global empire. Kozlowski's strategy was aggressive acquisition. He bought hundreds of companies, integrating them into Tyco's operations and cutting costs ruthlessly. He moved Tyco's headquarters to Bermuda to reduce tax obligations. He diversified the company's holdings across security systems, medical supplies, electronics, and other sectors. During the 1990s boom, Tyco's stock price soared. Kozlowski became one of the highest-paid CEOs in America, earning hundreds of millions in salary, bonuses, and stock options. But somewhere along the way, Kozlowski began to believe the rules didn't apply to him. He started taking unauthorized bonuses. He charged personal expenses to Tyco. He used company money to purchase art, real estate, and luxury items. The theft started small but escalated dramatically. By the late 1990s, Kozlowski was treating Tyco as his personal bank account. In 2001, Kozlowski purchased a $30 million apartment on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. The apartment was luxurious even by New York standards, with stunning views of Central Park. Kozlowski furnished it with $11 million in furniture, art, and decorations, all charged to Tyco. The apartment became infamous for its excesses. The shower curtains cost $6,000. A set of coat hangers cost $2,900. An umbrella stand shaped like a poodle cost $15,000. A wastebasket cost twice $200. Every item was purchased with company funds, most without proper board approval. Kozlowski also used Tyco money to purchase art. He spent $14.7 million on paintings, including works by Monet and Renoir. The art was supposed to be for Tyco offices, but most pieces ended up in Kozlowski's personal homes. When invoices were sent to Tyco, they listed the art as being for corporate offices, but Kozlowski had directed the paintings to his residences in New York and New Hampshire. The Sardinia birthday party in June 2001 epitomized Kozlowski's sense of entitlement. His second wife, Karen, was turning 40. Kozlowski wanted to throw her an unforgettable celebration. He flew dozens of guests to the Italian island of Sardinia, put them up in luxury hotels, and organized a toga-themed party at a historic villa. The entertainment included gladiators, a chariot, and an ice sculpture of Michelangelo's David with a special modification. It was made of vodka. Jimmy Buffett performed. The total cost was approximately $2 million. Kozlowski billed half the cost to Tyco, claiming the event was partly a shareholder meeting. A handful of Tyco board members attended, but the event was clearly a personal birthday celebration. Video of the party, later shown at trial, shocked viewers. The excess was breathtaking. While Tyco employees worked ordinary jobs for ordinary salaries, their CEO was throwing million-dollar toga parties on Mediterranean islands and charging the company. The theft might have continued indefinitely if not for a seemingly unrelated investigation. In 2002, Manhattan prosecutors were investigating art dealers who helped wealthy clients evade sales tax on art purchases. Kozlowski's name came up. He had purchased approximately $13 million in art and had it shipped to New Hampshire to avoid paying New York sales tax, even though the art was destined for his New York apartment. This was tax fraud. On June 3, 2002, Kozlowski was indicted on charges of evading $1 million in sales tax on art purchases. The indictment was embarrassing, but seemed relatively minor. Kozlowski was a billionaire CEO being charged with tax evasion, but the investigation had opened a door. Prosecutors began examining Kozlowski's relationship with Tyco more closely. They discovered the unauthorized bonuses, the apartment expenses, the birthday party, and years of personal spending charged to the company. On June 4, 2002, one day after the tax evasion indictment, Kozlowski resigned as Tyco's CEO. The company's board had learned about the unauthorized compensation and personal expenses. They had no choice but to push him out. Kozlowski's departure triggered a broader investigation into Tyco's finances and governance. The company's stock price plummeted as investors worried about the extent of the financial irregularities. In September 2002, Manhattan prosecutors indicted Kozlowski and Mark Swartz, Tyco's former CFO, on charges of grand larceny, enterprise corruption, securities fraud, and falsifying business records. The indictment alleged they had stolen $170 million in unauthorized bonuses and obtained $430 million through fraudulent stock sales. The charges were serious. If convicted, Kozlowski faced decades in state prison. The first trial began in 2003 but ended in a mistrial. A juror was accused of making an okay gesture to the defense team, suggesting bias. Rumors swirled about jury intimidation and misconduct. The judge declared a mistrial, and prosecutors prepared to try the case again. For Kozlowski, the mistrial was a brief reprieve, but the evidence against him remained overwhelming. The second trial began in January 2005. Prosecutors presented devastating evidence. They showed how Kozlowski and Swartz had taken $81 million in unauthorized bonuses, disguised as loan forgiveness programs that had never been properly approved. They demonstrated how Kozlowski had charged millions in personal expenses to Tyco, including the Fifth Avenue apartment, the art collection, and the Sardinia birthday party. They presented internal memos showing Kozlowski had tried to hide these expenses from the board and shareholders. The video of the Sardinia party was particularly damaging. Jurors watched as Kozlowski stood before his toga-clad guests, raised a glass, and proclaimed the party would showcase a Tyco core competency, the ability to party hard. The statement, made in jest, was played over and over in news coverage. It became the sound bite that defined Kozlowski's arrogance and sense of entitlement. Here was a CEO who had stolen hundreds of millions from shareholders and was boasting about his ability to throw lavish parties at company expense. Kozlowski's defense was that the compensation and expenses had been approved by the board. His attorneys argued that what prosecutors called theft was actually legitimate compensation that the board had authorized, either explicitly or implicitly. They claimed Kozlowski had disclosed the compensation in documents filed with securities regulators. They portrayed him as an aggressive CEO who had built tremendous shareholder value and deserved extraordinary compensation. The defense was not convincing. The evidence showed that much of the compensation had not been properly approved. The board had been misled about the nature and extent of Kozlowski's compensation. The personal expenses, like the birthday party and apartment furnishings, had been hidden from the board through misleading descriptions on invoices and expense reports. This wasn't legitimate compensation, it was theft. On June 17, 2005, the jury convicted Dennis Kozlowski on 22 of 23 counts, including grand larceny, securities fraud, conspiracy, and falsifying business records. Mark Swartz was also convicted. Kozlowski showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. His family wept in the courtroom. He was led away in handcuffs to await sentencing. The sentencing hearing took place on September 19, 2005. Prosecutors asked for the maximum sentence, arguing that Kozlowski had betrayed the trust of shareholders and employees. His attorneys asked for leniency, noting his age and his contributions to Tyco before his crimes. They emphasized that Tyco had thrived under his leadership and that shareholders had benefited from his strategic decisions, even if he had also stolen from the company. Judge Michael Obus was not swayed by the defense arguments. He noted the scale and audacity of the theft. He observed that Kozlowski and Swartz had looted the company while occupying positions of ultimate trust and responsibility. On September 19, 2005, Judge Obus sentenced Kozlowski to 8 years and 4 months to 25 years in state prison. The sentence meant Kozlowski would serve at least 8 years and 4 months before becoming eligible for parole. He was also ordered to pay $167 million in restitution and fines. Kozlowski was sent to the Mid-State Correctional Facility in Marcy, New York, a medium-security prison. The man who had lived in a $30 million Manhattan apartment now lived in a prison cell. He wore a prison uniform instead of tailored suits. He worked prison jobs for pennies an hour. The fall from power was absolute. In prison, Kozlowski had time to reflect on his crimes. In early parole hearings, he maintained his innocence and showed little remorse. The parole board denied his requests for early release, but eventually Kozlowski's attitude changed. In a 2013 parole hearing, he admitted his guilt and expressed genuine remorse. "It was greed, pure and simple," he told the parole board. "I feel horrible. I can't say how sorry I am and how deeply I regret my actions." The change appeared sincere. Kozlowski had spent years in prison. He had lost his fortune, his reputation, and his freedom. He had seen the harm his crimes caused to Tyco employees and shareholders. The admission of guilt and expression of remorse were necessary steps for parole, but they also seemed to reflect genuine understanding of his wrongdoing. On January 17, 2014, after serving approximately 6 years and 8 months, Dennis Kozlowski was granted parole. He was released to a work release program, living in a halfway house while working as a consultant. His parole required him to report regularly to authorities, maintain employment, and avoid any criminal activity. He was prohibited from serving as an officer or director of any public company. In 2015, his parole ended, and he became fully free. Since his release, Kozlowski has kept a relatively low profile. He works as a consultant advising companies on mergers and acquisitions, drawing on his decades of business experience. He has also volunteered with the Fortune Society, a nonprofit that helps formerly incarcerated people reintegrate into society. Kozlowski speaks to at-risk youth and others about his crimes and the consequences he faced. His work with the Fortune Society suggests genuine remorse and a desire to make some form of amends. In interviews since his release, Kozlowski has been candid about his crimes. He has acknowledged that greed drove his behavior. He has admitted that the power and wealth went to his head. He has expressed regret for the harm he caused to Tyco employees and shareholders. Whether this remorse is genuine or strategic is impossible to know with certainty, but his actions since release suggest at least some commitment to living differently. The Tyco scandal had significant consequences beyond Kozlowski's imprisonment. The company's board was restructured. New governance procedures were implemented to prevent future executive theft. Tyco paid approximately $3 billion to settle shareholder lawsuits. The company's reputation was damaged, though the business continued to operate. In 2016, Tyco merged with Johnson Controls, ending its existence as an independent entity. What made the Kozlowski case so memorable was the visceral nature of the excess. Abstract financial fraud is difficult for ordinary people to understand, but everyone can understand $6,000 shower curtains and $15,000 umbrella stands. The video of the Sardinia party, with its vodka-urinating ice sculpture and Jimmy Buffett concert, made the theft concrete and offensive. This wasn't some complicated accounting scheme. This was a CEO literally throwing million-dollar parties with stolen money. The case became a symbol of early 2000s corporate greed. Along with Enron, WorldCom, and other scandals, the Tyco case represented a period when corporate executives seemed to believe they could loot their companies with impunity. The prosecutions and prison sentences that followed sent a message that such behavior would not be tolerated. CEOs and CFOs faced personal criminal liability for theft and fraud, not just civil penalties or regulatory sanctions. Dennis Kozlowski paid a heavy price for his crimes. He served nearly 7 years in prison. He paid $167 million in fines and restitution, wiping out most of his wealth. His reputation was destroyed. He went from being celebrated as a brilliant CEO to being mocked as the poster child for corporate greed. The shower curtains and toga party became punchlines that will follow him for the rest of his life. But unlike some corporate criminals who maintain their innocence and show no remorse, Kozlowski has acknowledged his wrongdoing. His admission that it was greed, pure and simple, was an unusually direct statement from a convicted executive. His volunteer work with formerly incarcerated people suggests a genuine desire to do something positive with his remaining years. Whether these actions fully redeem him is debatable, but they distinguish him from many other white-collar criminals who never accept responsibility for their actions. For Tyco's shareholders and employees, Kozlowski's imprisonment and repayment of restitution provided some accountability. The $167 million he paid back, while only a fraction of what he stole, was substantial. His prison sentence demonstrated that even powerful CEOs face consequences for theft. But the stolen money, the damaged careers, the lost trust, these harms couldn't be fully remedied by any sentence or restitution payment. The Tyco scandal remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of inadequate board oversight and unchecked executive power. Kozlowski was able to steal hundreds of millions because the Tyco board didn't properly supervise his compensation and expenses. They trusted him to police himself. That trust was catastrophically misplaced. The case demonstrated the necessity of independent board oversight, transparent compensation practices, and robust internal controls to prevent executive theft. Dennis Kozlowski will be remembered not for building Tyco into a global conglomerate, but for the vodka-urinating ice sculpture and the $6,000 shower curtains. His legitimate business accomplishments are overshadowed by his crimes. The toga party in Sardinia, meant to celebrate his wife's birthday in style, instead became the enduring symbol of his greed and the theft that sent him to prison. It's a legacy of excess, hubris, and ultimately remorse, a reminder that even the most powerful executives cannot escape the consequences of treating corporate assets as personal property. Case 8. Martin Shkreli. Martin Shkreli became the most hated man in America overnight. In September 2015, his pharmaceutical company raised the price of Daraprim, a life-saving drug used by HIV and cancer patients, from $13.50 per pill to $7.50, a 5,000% increase. When confronted, Shkreli smirked and defended the decision as capitalism at work. He trolled critics on Twitter. He bought the only copy of a Wu-Tang Clan album for $2 million. He live-streamed himself playing video games and offering business advice. The media dubbed him PharmaBro, and the nickname stuck. But while the public raged about drug prices, federal prosecutors were building a different case. Shkreli's downfall came not from price gouging, which was legal, but from securities fraud he had committed years earlier at his hedge funds. His trial would reveal a pattern of lies, deception, and self-dealing that predated his pharmaceutical notoriety. Martin Shkreli was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1983 to Albanian and Croatian immigrant parents. His father was a janitor. His mother worked as a secretary. Shkreli was intellectually gifted and intensely ambitious. He attended a prestigious New York City high school for science and mathematics. While still in high school, he began working as an intern at a hedge fund. He was fascinated by finance and convinced he could outperform the market through careful analysis. After graduating from Baruch College in 2004, Shkreli worked briefly at several financial firms, but he had entrepreneurial ambitions. In 2009, at age 26, he founded MSMB Capital Management, a hedge fund focused on healthcare and biotech stocks. Shkreli presented himself as a boy genius who understood pharmaceutical companies better than anyone else. He told investors he would generate extraordinary returns through sophisticated trading strategies. The reality was far less impressive. MSMB Capital lost money almost immediately. Shkreli made bad bets on biotech stocks. His trading strategies didn't work as anticipated. Within months, the fund had lost virtually all its capital. Rather than admit failure to his investors, Shkreli lied. He sent them account statements showing positive returns. He claimed the fund was performing well. The statements were fiction. When investors asked to withdraw their money, Shkreli faced a problem. The money wasn't there. He had lost it. But he couldn't admit that without exposing his lies. So Shkreli did what Ponzi schemers have done for generations. He started a second fund to raise money to pay back the first fund's investors. In 2010, he founded MSMB Healthcare Management, telling new investors it would focus on biotech investments. Much of the money raised for MSMB Healthcare was used to pay back angry MSMB capital investors. The scheme required constant new money. Shkreli was running on a treadmill, always needing more capital to cover previous losses and lies. In 2011, he founded Retrofin, a pharmaceutical company, and took it public. Retrofin gave Shkreli access to company assets he could use to continue paying back his hedge fund investors. He used Retrofin stock and cash to settle disputes with people he owed money from the hedge fund failures. This was self-dealing on a massive scale. Shkreli was using a public company's resources to resolve his personal financial problems. Retrofin's board of directors eventually discovered what he was doing. In 2014, they fired Shkreli and sued him for misusing company assets. The lawsuit laid out in detail how Shkreli had taken millions from Retrofin to pay off hedge fund investors who threatened to sue him. After being fired from Retrofin, Shkreli founded Turing Pharmaceuticals in 2015. This company would make him infamous. In August 2015, Turing acquired the rights to Daraprim, an anti-parasitic drug that had been on the market since 1953. Daraprim treats toxoplasmosis, a parasitic infection that can be life-threatening for people with compromised immune systems, including HIV patients, cancer patients, and pregnant women. On September 17, 2015, Shkreli announced that Turing was raising the price of Daraprim from $13.50 to $750 per pill. The increase was immediate and staggering. Patients and doctors were outraged. A full course of treatment that had cost hundreds of dollars now cost hundreds of thousands. Insurance companies would absorb much of the cost, but patients still faced massive out-of-pocket expenses. For some patients, the drug became unaffordable. Shkreli's response to the outrage made things worse. He appeared on television defending the price increase. He claimed the higher price would fund research into better treatments. He argued that insurance companies, not patients, would pay most of the cost. He suggested that anyone criticizing him simply didn't understand pharmaceutical economics. His smirking demeanor and dismissive attitude inflamed public anger. On social media, Shkreli was even more provocative. He trolled journalists who criticized him. He posted screenshots of his financial accounts showing his wealth. He engaged in Twitter feuds with critics, calling them names and mocking their concerns. He seemed to revel in being despised. The attention fed his ego even as it destroyed his reputation. Presidential candidates condemned Shkreli. Hillary Clinton called the price hike price gouging and proposed legislation to address pharmaceutical pricing. Donald Trump called Shkreli a spoiled brat. Congressional committees demanded he testify. The pharmaceutical industry tried to distance itself from him, with industry groups condemning the price increase. Shkreli had become toxic. While Shkreli was making headlines for drug pricing, federal prosecutors in Brooklyn were building a securities fraud case. They had been investigating his hedge fund activities for years. The lawsuit filed by Retrofin had provided prosecutors with a roadmap of his alleged crimes. On December 17, 2015, FBI agents arrested Shkreli at his Manhattan apartment. He was charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy related to his operation of MSMB Capital and MSMB Healthcare. The indictment alleged that Shkreli had lied to investors about his hedge fund's performance and assets. He had told investors MSMB Capital managed $35 million when it actually had less than $1,000. He had sent fake account statements showing profits when the funds had lost money. He had used Retrofin's assets to pay back defrauded investors, enriching himself in the process. The charges carried a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. Shkreli was released on $5 million bail. Rather than keep a low profile while awaiting trial, he continued his provocative online behavior. He live-streamed for hours, offering commentary on business, finance, and pharmaceuticals. He bought the only copy of Wu-Tang Clan's album, Once Upon a Time in Shaolin, for $2 million and bragged about owning it. He bid over $100,000 for a lunch with Berkshire Hathaway's Warren Buffett. His attorney's attempts to convince him to behave more circumspectly were unsuccessful. In September 2017, weeks after his conviction but before sentencing, Shkreli posted on Facebook offering $5,000 to anyone who could grab a strand of Hillary Clinton's hair during her book tour. He claimed it was satire. Federal prosecutors and the judge did not find it amusing. The post appeared to be soliciting assault. Judge Kyo Matsumoto revoked Shkreli's bail and sent him to jail to await sentencing. His freedom was over. The trial had taken place in summer 2017. Prosecutors presented evidence that Shkreli had systematically lied to investors. They showed fake account statements, emails where Shkreli made false claims about fund performance, and testimony from investors who had been deceived. They demonstrated how Shkreli had used Retrofin to pay back defrauded hedge fund investors, essentially using one group of victims' money to compensate another group. Shkreli's defense was that his investors had ultimately made money. His attorneys argued that even though Shkreli had lied about MSMB's performance, he had eventually made his investors whole by giving them Retrofin stock. They portrayed the case as a dispute over corporate governance, not criminal fraud. They suggested Shkreli was being prosecuted because of his controversial public persona, not because he had committed serious crimes. The jury didn't buy it. On August 4, 2017, they convicted Shkreli on 2 counts of securities fraud and 1 count of conspiracy. He was acquitted on other counts, but the guilty verdicts were serious. Shkreli showed little reaction to the verdict. Outside the courthouse, he told reporters the government had wasted time prosecuting him. He maintained his characteristic arrogance even in the face of potential decades in prison. The sentencing hearing took place on March 9, 2018. Prosecutors asked for a substantial sentence, arguing Shkreli had shown no remorse and continued to behave recklessly. His attorneys asked for leniency, emphasizing that investors had ultimately been repaid. They presented letters from family and friends describing Shkreli as misunderstood, noting his intelligence and his stated desire to work on pharmaceutical research that could help patients. Before being sentenced, Shkreli addressed the court. He cried as he spoke, a stark contrast to his usual smirking demeanor. He apologized to investors and said he had learned from his mistakes. He acknowledged that his behavior on social media had been inappropriate. His remorse appeared genuine, though many observers wondered if it was performance designed to reduce his sentence. Judge Matsumoto was not swayed. She acknowledged Shkreli's intelligence, but noted he had used it for fraud. She pointed to his pattern of lying and his inability to control his behavior, even while on bail awaiting sentencing. She observed that he had shown little genuine remorse until facing the prospect of prison. On March 9, 2018, Judge Matsumoto sentenced Martin Shkreli to 7 years in federal prison. She also ordered him to forfeit $7.4 million, including the Wu-Tang Clan album, a Picasso painting, and other assets. The 7-year sentence was less than prosecutors had requested, but more than the defense had hoped for. At 34 years old, Shkreli would spend much of his 30s in federal prison. He was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution in Fort Dix, New Jersey, a low-security prison. The man who had live-streamed his life for millions was now behind bars. While Shkreli served his sentence, additional consequences followed. In January 2022, a federal judge imposed a lifetime ban on Shkreli working in the pharmaceutical industry. The ban was part of a civil case brought by the Federal Trade Commission and several states related to the Daraprim price increase. The judge also ordered Shkreli to pay $64.6 million in disgorgement of profits from the drug price hike. The lifetime ban meant that even after his release from prison, Shkreli could never return to the industry that had made him infamous. The civil case established that Shkreli's conduct regarding Daraprim, while not criminally prosecuted, was anti-competitive and harmful. Evidence showed he had taken steps to prevent generic competition, ensuring Daraprim remained the only treatment option at the inflated price. The lifetime ban was unprecedented. No other pharmaceutical executive had been permanently barred from the industry. In May 2022, Shkreli was released from prison to a halfway house after serving approximately 4.5 years of his 7-year sentence. The early release reflected good behavior credits available to federal inmates. In September 2022, he was fully released and began 3 years of supervised release. At 39 years old, he returned to society with a destroyed reputation and limited career options. Since his release, Shkreli has kept a relatively low profile compared to his pre-prison behavior. He has given some interviews claiming he has changed and learned from his experience. He has expressed regret about his past conduct, particularly his social media trolling. He has discussed wanting to work in biotechnology research, though the lifetime ban from the pharmaceutical industry severely limits his options. Whether his professed remorse is genuine or strategic remains debatable. What made the Shkreli case unusual was the disconnect between what made him famous and what sent him to prison. The public knew him for raising drug prices, an action that, while widely condemned, was legal. His actual crimes were securities fraud at his hedge funds, which most people had never heard of until his arrest. The irony was that the behavior that made him America's most hated CEO wasn't what convicted him. The case highlighted problems in pharmaceutical pricing that persist today. Shkreli's extreme example drew attention to the broader issue of drug price increases that, while less dramatic than 5,000%, significantly impact patients and healthcare costs. His prosecution for securities fraud did nothing to address the systemic problems that allowed drug prices to increase without meaningful oversight or competition. Shkreli became a symbol of a particular kind of millennial arrogance and entitlement. His social media trolling, his ostentatious displays of wealth, his sneering at critics, all of it made him a perfect villain for the internet age. He seemed to embody the worst aspects of financial sector greed combined with tech industry disregard for social norms. His downfall was satisfying to many who had watched him flaunt his wealth and mock critics. But the case also illustrated how privilege and connections can protect white-collar criminals, at least temporarily. Shkreli committed his hedge fund frauds in 2009-2014, but wasn't arrested until 2015, and only after he had become infamous for drug pricing. If he had remained obscure, he might have avoided prosecution entirely. The attention drawn by the Daraprim controversy made him a target prosecutors couldn't ignore. The lifetime pharmaceutical industry ban may be Shkreli's most lasting punishment. 7 years in prison is significant, but he was released in his late 30s with decades of life ahead. The industry ban, however, permanently blocks him from the field where he claimed expertise. He cannot work for pharmaceutical companies, consult for them, or invest in them. The career he built is permanently closed to him. Martin Shkreli's story is a reminder that intelligence without ethics becomes a tool for harm. He was undeniably smart. His understanding of biotech stocks and pharmaceutical business models was sophisticated, but he used that intelligence to defraud investors, manipulate stock prices, and exploit patients who needed life-saving medication. His smirking public persona masked a pattern of lies and self-dealing that ultimately led to conviction and imprisonment. For the investors he defrauded, for the patients who struggled to afford Daraprim, for the healthcare system burdened by his price gouging, Shkreli's imprisonment and lifetime industry ban offer some accountability. But they don't undo the harm. The investors' money was eventually recovered, but only after years of stress and uncertainty. The patients still paid inflated prices for medication, and the pharmaceutical pricing problems that Shkreli exemplified continue largely unaddressed. PharmaBro became federal inmate number 8785-053, his trolling silenced, his smirk replaced by the grim reality of prison. His 7 years behind bars taught him, by his own later admission, that it was greed, pure and simple. Whether that lesson will prevent future Martin Shkrelis from emerging in the pharmaceutical and financial industries remains to be seen. What is certain is that his case demonstrated that even the most arrogant and seemingly untouchable executives can face serious consequences when their frauds are finally exposed and prosecuted. Case 9. Stuart Parnell. Stuart Parnell ran his peanut butter business from a converted garage behind his Virginia home. The Peanut Corporation of America was a bare-bones operation that survived on thin margins, selling peanut paste to manufacturers who used it in crackers, cookies, ice cream, and other products. The company's Blakely, Georgia plant had leaking roofs, inadequate sanitation, and minimal quality control. Between 2007 and 2008, products from the plant tested positive for salmonella contamination at least 12 times. Each time, Parnell had a choice: halt production, fix the problems, and protect consumers, or keep shipping products to avoid losing money. He chose profit over safety. When told that test results weren't yet available for a shipment, Parnell sent a now infamous email: "Just ship it." The contaminated peanut products would trigger the deadliest salmonella outbreak in recent American history. 9 people died. More than 700 were sickened, and the CDC estimated the true toll was closer to 22,000 infections. Stuart Parnell's 28-year prison sentence would become the harshest ever imposed in a food safety case. Stuart Parnell came from a peanut family. His father, Hugh Parnell, had founded a peanut processing company in Gorman, Texas in 1977. The business was sold in the mid-1990s, but in 2000, Stuart bought back the Peanut Corporation of America in a private sale. He operated processing facilities in Georgia, Virginia, and Texas, selling peanut products primarily to the institutional food market, schools, prisons, nursing homes, and to food manufacturers who used peanut paste in their products. Parnell ran PCA on an extremely tight budget. The company employed minimum wage workers. It operated from aging facilities that received minimal maintenance. Parnell himself worked from a converted garage behind his suburban home in Lynchburg, Virginia, managing a multi-million-dollar business with minimal overhead. The penny-pinching approach had helped the company survive in a competitive market, but it also meant corners were cut on safety and quality control. The Blakely, Georgia plant was PCA's largest facility. Peanuts arrived from farms, were roasted and ground into paste, then shipped to food manufacturers. The plant was old and poorly maintained. The roof leaked, allowing water and potential contaminants to enter the facility. Condensation dripped from ceilings onto food contact surfaces. Sanitation procedures were inadequate. The facility employed few quality control personnel, and those it had were pressured to keep production moving rather than halt operations for safety concerns. In 2007, salmonella contamination began appearing in PCA's products. When the company tested samples and found positive results, Parnell faced a decision. Proper procedure would be to halt shipments, deep clean the facility, identify the contamination source, and retest. But halting production meant losing revenue. Parnell consistently chose to keep shipping. The pattern was systematic. When an initial test showed salmonella contamination, Parnell would order a retest. If the retest came back negative, he would ship the product and ignore the positive result. If retests continued to show contamination, PCA would sometimes send samples to different laboratories until they got a negative result they could use to justify shipping. In some cases, PCA simply fabricated certificates of analysis, creating fake documents that showed negative salmonella tests when no such tests had been conducted or when tests had shown contamination. Internal emails, later discovered by federal investigators, revealed Parnell's priorities. In one exchange, when told that test results were delayed and a shipment couldn't be released, Parnell wrote, "Just ship it." In another email, after learning of positive salmonella tests, he complained, "I go through this about once a week. The delay is costing us huge dollars." When a laboratory reported positive results for salmonella, Parnell wrote to employees, "Turn them loose," meaning ship the products despite the contamination. In January 2009, public health officials began investigating a national salmonella outbreak. People across the United States were falling ill with Salmonella typhimurium, a bacterial strain that causes severe gastrointestinal distress. The CDC and state health departments traced the outbreak to peanut butter and peanut paste. Epidemiological analysis and laboratory testing eventually identified the source, the Peanut Corporation of America's Blakely plant. The outbreak was devastating. Over 700 people became sick enough to seek medical attention and have their illnesses confirmed. 9 people died. The victims included a 72-year-old woman recovering from cancer in a Minnesota nursing home who died after eating peanut butter toast. A 3-year-old boy who ate contaminated peanut butter crackers became critically ill. An elderly man in Ohio died days after consuming products containing PCA's peanut paste. These weren't abstract victims. They were grandmothers and children who died painful, preventable deaths because Stuart Parnell chose profits over safety. The CDC estimated that the actual number of infections was much higher than confirmed cases. Many people with food poisoning don't seek medical care or get tested. Based on epidemiological models, the CDC calculated that approximately 22,000 people had been infected. The outbreak affected people in 46 states, making it one of the most widespread foodborne illness incidents in American history. The contamination triggered the largest food recall in U.S. history up to that time. More than 3,900 different products from more than 360 companies were recalled. Keebler crackers, Famous Amos cookies, Austin Toasty crackers, Little Debbie snacks, countless products contained PCA's contaminated peanut paste. Even pet food and treats were recalled. The recall devastated the peanut industry, causing billions of dollars in losses to companies that had done nothing wrong but had the misfortune of using PCA as a supplier. On January 13, 2009, PCA shut down production at the Blakely plant. On February 13, 2009, the company ceased all operations and filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy liquidation. The company was finished. Federal authorities launched both civil and criminal investigations into what had gone wrong. What they found was shocking. FDA investigators inspected the Blakely plant and discovered appalling conditions. Roofs leaked, allowing water to drip onto food processing equipment. Dead rodents and their excrement were found throughout the facility. Mold grew on walls and ceilings. Basic sanitation procedures were ignored. The plant should never have been operating, yet it had passed Georgia state inspections and continued shipping products used in foods consumed by millions of Americans. The investigation also uncovered PCA's systematic cover-up. Investigators found emails showing that Parnell and other executives knew about positive salmonella tests but shipped products anyway. They discovered fabricated certificates of analysis that falsely claimed products had tested negative for contamination. They found evidence that PCA had never informed customers about positive test results, instead claiming that all shipments met food safety standards. On February 21, 2013, a federal grand jury indicted Stuart Parnell on 76 criminal counts. The charges included conspiracy to defraud customers, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and introducing adulterated food into interstate commerce. His brother, Michael Parnell, who worked as a food broker for PCA, was also indicted. Mary Wilkerson, a quality assurance manager at the Blakely plant, faced charges as well. The indictment alleged that Stuart Parnell had presided over a conspiracy to ship contaminated food products. It detailed specific instances where PCA had received positive salmonella tests and shipped products anyway. It showed how the company had falsified test results and misled customers about food safety. The charges were unprecedented. Never before had federal prosecutors brought criminal felony charges against food industry executives in connection with a foodborne illness outbreak. Stuart Parnell maintained his innocence. His defense attorneys argued that he had not known about the contamination, that he had relied on employees and consultants to handle food safety issues, and that he had been unfairly targeted as a scapegoat for a tragedy caused by inadequate government oversight and industry-wide problems. The trial began in July 2014 in federal court in Albany, Georgia, near the site of the Blakely plant. Prosecutors presented the damning emails showing Parnell's knowledge of contamination and his decisions to ship anyway. They called victims and family members who described the suffering caused by the outbreak. They brought forward former PCA employees who testified about the pressure to ship products regardless of test results. One of the most powerful testimonies came from Jeff Almer, whose 72-year-old mother Shirley had died after eating contaminated peanut butter in the Minnesota nursing home. Shirley Almer had survived brain cancer and lung cancer. She was recovering from a urinary tract infection and looking forward to leaving the nursing home to spend Christmas 2008 with her family. She never made it. She contracted salmonella from peanut butter served at breakfast, became severely ill, and died. Jeff Almer wept as he described his mother's death and his determination to hold those responsible accountable. The jury heard testimony about Jacob Hurley, who was 3 years old when he ate Austin Toasty crackers with peanut butter in January 2009. He became violently ill with salmonella, vomiting and suffering from diarrhea for nearly 2 weeks. His parents rushed him to the hospital multiple times, fearing for his life. Though Jacob survived, the trauma affected the entire family. At Parnell's sentencing, 10-year-old Jacob would tell the judge, "I think it's okay for him to spend the rest of his life in prison." On September 19, 2014, after 6 weeks of testimony, the jury convicted Stuart Parnell on 67 of 68 counts. Michael Parnell was convicted on multiple counts. Mary Wilkerson was convicted of obstruction of justice. The convictions were groundbreaking. For the first time, a jury had found food industry executives criminally responsible for a deadly outbreak. The verdict established that corporate officers could face serious prison time for knowingly shipping contaminated food. The sentencing hearing took place on September 21, 2015, almost a year after the conviction. Victims and their families filled the courtroom. 9 people spoke about loved ones who had died. Others described illnesses that had left lasting effects. Jeff Almer addressed Parnell directly. "You took my mom. You kicked her right off the cliff." Before being sentenced, Stuart Parnell finally apologized. Speaking in a shaky voice, wearing a rumpled white shirt and khaki pants, he told the courtroom, "I'm truly sorry for what happened." He acknowledged problems at his peanut plant, but never directly addressed the emails showing he had knowingly shipped contaminated products. For many victims and family members, the apology came far too late and seemed insufficient given the evidence of his deliberate actions. Senior U.S. District Judge W. Lewis Sands faced an extraordinary sentencing decision. Federal guidelines suggested a sentence of hundreds of years based on the number of victims and the severity of harm. Prosecutors asked for a lengthy sentence to send a message to the food industry. Defense attorneys asked for leniency, noting Parnell's age and arguing that he had not intended to kill anyone. Judge Sands was unmoved by the defense arguments. He noted the systematic nature of the fraud, the repeated decisions to ship contaminated products, and the 9 deaths that resulted. On September 21, 2015, Judge Sands sentenced Stuart Parnell to 28 years, 336 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. It was the harshest sentence ever imposed in a food safety case in American history. Michael Parnell, Stuart's brother, received a 20-year sentence. Mary Wilkerson received 5 years. Additional PCA employees who had pleaded guilty received shorter sentences ranging from 3 to 6 years. The sentences sent shockwaves through the food industry. Executives and quality control managers at food companies suddenly understood they faced personal criminal liability if their products sickened or killed consumers. Stuart Parnell is currently serving his sentence in federal prison. At 61 years old when sentenced, he will be in his late 80s if he serves his full term. More realistically, with good behavior credits, he could be released in his early 80s. Either way, he will spend most or all of his remaining years behind bars. The Peanut Corporation of America case had far-reaching consequences beyond Parnell's imprisonment. The outbreak led directly to passage of the Food Safety Modernization Act of 2011, the most significant reform of food safety laws in more than 70 years. The law gave the FDA new powers to order recalls, suspend facility registrations, and require preventive controls at food processing plants. It mandated more frequent inspections and increased penalties for violations. The case also changed how food companies approach safety. Many companies implemented more rigorous testing protocols and third-party audits. The Just Ship It email became infamous in the food industry, used in training sessions as an example of what never to do. Food safety managers understood that cutting corners on testing and sanitation could result not just in recalls and civil liability, but in criminal prosecution and prison time. For the victims and their families, Parnell's sentence offered some measure of justice, but couldn't undo the harm. Shirley Almer remained dead. Jacob Hurley and hundreds of others would always remember their illnesses. The trauma rippled through families and communities. Jeff Almer channeled his grief into advocacy, testifying before Congress and lobbying for stronger food safety laws. His mother's death would not be in vain if it led to reforms that prevented future tragedies. What made the case stand out was the directness of the harm. This wasn't financial fraud where investors lost money. People died from eating peanut butter. Children became critically ill from eating crackers. The emails showing Parnell's knowledge made the crime especially egregious. He knew products tested positive for salmonella. He knew contamination could make people sick. He shipped the products anyway because delays cost us huge dollars. The case demonstrated that business failure and financial pressure do not excuse endangering public health. PCA was struggling financially. The peanut paste market was competitive and margins were thin. Parnell felt pressure to keep shipments moving and revenue coming in. But those pressures didn't justify knowingly shipping contaminated food. Thousands of other food companies faced similar financial pressures without resorting to criminal conduct. Stuart Parnell's 28-year sentence reflects both the severity of his actions and the need to deter similar conduct by other food industry executives. Judge Sands made clear that the sentence was meant to send a message. Corporate officers who knowingly endanger consumers to protect profits will face serious consequences. The food industry, which touches every American's life multiple times every day, requires executives who prioritize safety over short-term financial concerns. For the families who lost loved ones to salmonella from PCA's peanut products, Parnell's imprisonment provides accountability but not closure. Shirley Almer, who beat cancer twice only to die from contaminated peanut butter toast, cannot be brought back. The other 8 victims, whose names became part of the court record, whose deaths were preventable, whose families still grieve, remain gone. Their deaths serve as a reminder that food safety is not an abstract regulatory concern, but a matter of life and death. The Peanut Corporation of America scandal revealed dangerous weaknesses in America's food safety system. A small, poorly run company operating from a leaking, unsanitary facility had been able to supply products that ended up in thousands of consumer goods. State inspectors had failed to identify serious problems. Federal oversight was inadequate. The system depended on companies policing themselves, and PCA had proved catastrophically that such self-regulation was insufficient. Stuart Parnell will spend his remaining years in federal prison, his freedom gone, his company destroyed, his reputation as nothing more than the man who knowingly poisoned America's food supply. The emails, "Just ship it," "Turn them loose," costing us huge dollars, will forever define his legacy. They are evidence of a corporate executive who valued money over human life, who chose profits over basic decency, and who paid the highest price the criminal justice system could exact for those choices. His case remains a stark warning to anyone in the food industry. The public's trust is not just a business asset to be exploited, but a sacred responsibility, the violation of which can and should result in decades behind bars. Case 10. John Regas. In the small town of Cooter Sport, population 2,500, John Regas was a hero. He had started with a single movie theater in 1952 and built Adelphia Communications into one of the largest cable companies in America. He employed thousands of local residents. He donated to schools and hospitals. He built a golf course and hockey rink for the community. The Regas name was synonymous with success and generosity in rural Pennsylvania. But behind the philanthropic facade, Regas and his sons were using Adelphia as their personal bank account. They took $3.1 billion in off-book loans to fund the family's lifestyle. They hid massive debts through fraudulent accounting. They treated a public company with thousands of shareholders as family property. When the fraud was finally exposed in 2002, Adelphia filed for bankruptcy. 15,000 employees lost their jobs, and John Regas, at 77 years old, faced the prospect of dying in federal prison for crimes that destroyed the empire he had spent 5 decades building. John Regas was born in Wellsville, New York in 1924 to Greek immigrant parents. His father ran a small hot dog restaurant. The family had little money, but they valued hard work and education. Regas served in the Army during World War II, then used the GI Bill to attend college. He graduated from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute with a degree in engineering. In 1952, he borrowed $300 to purchase a movie theater in Coudersport, a small town in rural Pennsylvania. The movie theater led to opportunity. In the 1950s, as television began spreading across America, Coudersport remained beyond the reach of broadcast signals. The mountains surrounding the town blocked transmissions. Regas saw a business opportunity: cable television. In 1952, he founded Adelphia Communications, the name coming from the Greek word for brothers. He began stringing cable to bring television to Coudersport residents. The cable business grew steadily. Adelphia expanded to other rural areas underserved by broadcast television. Regas had a knack for identifying markets where cable could succeed and for managing operations efficiently. By the 1980s, Adelphia had become a significant regional cable operator. In 1986, Rigas took the company public, raising capital to fund further expansion. Throughout the 1990s, Adelphia went on an acquisition spree, buying smaller cable systems and growing into one of the largest cable companies in the United States. By 2001, Adelphia served approximately 5.6 million subscribers in 32 states, making it the sixth largest cable company in America. The company was headquartered in Coudersport, an unusual choice that reflected Rigas's loyalty to his adopted hometown. While other major corporations moved to large cities, Adelphia remained rooted in rural Pennsylvania, providing employment and economic vitality to a region that had few other major employers. But Adelphia was never truly a public company. In the traditional sense, John Rigas maintained control through a dual-class stock structure that gave his family supervoting shares. He installed his sons in senior executive positions. Michael Rigas became executive vice president. Timothy Rigas became chief financial officer. James Rigas ran operations. John's son-in-law, Peter Venetis, held a senior position. The board of directors included family members and friends. There was virtually no independent oversight. The Rigas family treated Adelphia as a dynasty, not as a corporation, with duties to public shareholders. This family control enabled systematic fraud. Beginning in the late 1990s, the Rigas family began borrowing enormous sums from Adelphia. The loans were made through complex structures involving off-balance sheet entities and related party transactions. The family borrowed to fund personal investments, to purchase luxury items, to construct a golf course, and to cover personal expenses. The amounts were staggering. By 2002, the Rigas family had borrowed approximately $3.1 billion from Adelphia. These loans were not properly disclosed to shareholders. Adelphia's financial statements did not reveal the true extent of the family's borrowing. The company used off-balance sheet entities to hide debt, making Adelphia appear more financially healthy than it actually was. When the family used company money for personal expenses, those transactions were not disclosed as required by securities laws. The fraud was systematic and sustained, continuing for years. The family's personal spending was extravagant. John Rigas used Adelphia funds to build a private golf course. The company paid for the New York City apartment where his daughter and son-in-law lived. Adelphia funded the construction of a hockey rink. The company's money paid for luxury apartments and vacation properties. Timothy Rigas used $12 million in company funds to build a personal home. The family treated Adelphia's treasury as an unlimited source of money for any project or purchase that interested them. Adelphia also engaged in accounting fraud to hide the extent of its debt. The company inflated subscriber numbers to make its operations appear more successful. It misclassified expenses as capital expenditures to improve reported earnings. It failed to disclose related party transactions as required by securities regulations. The company's financial statements became increasingly divorced from reality as the family sought to maintain the appearance of a thriving business while looting its assets. The fraud began to unravel in early 2002. Adelphia's auditors, Deloitte and Touche, were reviewing the company's financial statements and discovered irregularities. The auditors found evidence of undisclosed related party transactions and hidden debt. They demanded explanations. On March 27, 2002, Adelphia filed a quarterly report with the Securities and Exchange Commission disclosing that the Rigas family had borrowed $2.3 billion from the company. The disclosure shocked investors and regulators. Adelphia's stock price collapsed. The disclosure raised obvious questions. Why had the family borrowed so much money? Where had the money gone? Why hadn't these loans been disclosed earlier? Were the loans ever going to be repaid? As investigators began examining Adelphia's finances more closely, the full extent of the fraud became apparent. The company had hidden billions in debt. The family had taken massive unauthorized loans. The financial statements had been manipulated for years. On May 15, 2002, Adelphia's board of directors removed John Regas as CEO and forced him to resign from the board. His sons Timothy and Michael were also forced out. The company announced it was cooperating with federal authorities investigating potential fraud. Adelphia's stock, which had traded above $20 per share a year earlier, fell to less than $1. On June 25, 2002, Adelphia filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. At the time, it was the fourth largest bankruptcy in American history, with approximately $25 billion in assets and liabilities. The bankruptcy would wipe out shareholders' investments and threaten thousands of jobs. The company that John Regas had spent 50 years building was collapsing under the weight of the family's fraud. On July 24, 2002, federal prosecutors in Manhattan arrested John Regas, his sons Timothy and Michael, and two other Adelphia executives. They were charged with conspiracy, bank fraud, wire fraud, and securities fraud. The indictment alleged that the Regas family had systematically looted Adelphia, using it as their personal piggy bank while deceiving shareholders and creditors about the company's true financial condition. John Regas, now 77 years old, maintained his innocence. He claimed the loans had been legitimate business transactions approved by the board. He insisted he had built Adelphia from nothing and had always acted in the company's best interests. His attorneys portrayed him as an elderly entrepreneur being scapegoated for complex corporate transactions that regulators and prosecutors didn't understand. The trial began in March 2004 in federal court in Manhattan. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of fraud. They showed how the Regas family had taken $3.1 billion in company funds without proper disclosure or board approval. They demonstrated how Adelphia's financial statements had been manipulated to hide debt and inflate performance. They brought forward employees who testified about pressure to falsify records and hide transactions from auditors. One particularly damaging piece of evidence was the sheer extravagance of the family's spending. Prosecutors showed that Adelphia money had been used to build John Regas's private golf course, to pay for his family members' apartments, to fund personal investments that benefited the Regas family, but not Adelphia shareholders. The jurors heard about Timothy Regas using $12 million in company funds to build his personal home. They saw how the family had treated Adelphia as an unlimited source of money for their personal enrichment. The defense argued that the transactions had been known to the board and auditors, that the family had intended to repay the loans, and that the family's interests were aligned with shareholders since they owned significant stock in the company. They portrayed the prosecution as a politically motivated attack on successful businessmen. They emphasized John Regas's age and his decades of building Adelphia as evidence that he would never intentionally destroy his life's work. On July 8, 2004, the jury convicted John Regas and his son Timothy on conspiracy, bank fraud, and securities fraud charges. Michael Regas and the other defendants were acquitted. The split verdict was unusual, but not unprecedented. The jury had apparently concluded that John and Timothy bore primary responsibility for the fraud, while Michael and others had played lesser roles or had not been proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. John Regas showed no emotion as the verdict was read. His family wept. At 79 years old, he faced the prospect of spending his remaining years in prison. Timothy Regas, convicted alongside his father, faced decades behind bars. Their convictions marked a stunning fall for a family that had been celebrated as business success story and community pillars. The sentencing hearing took place on June 20, 2005. Prosecutors asked for lengthy sentences to hold the Regases accountable for their massive fraud. Defense attorneys asked for leniency, particularly for John Regas, given his advanced age and failing health. They noted that he had built a legitimate business that had employed thousands of people and served millions of customers. They argued that the fraud, while serious, should not result in a de facto life sentence for an elderly man. U.S. District Judge Leonard Sand rejected the leniency arguments. He noted the extraordinary scale of the fraud and the harm caused to employees and shareholders. He observed that the Regas family had betrayed the trust of everyone who had invested in or worked for Adelphia. On June 20, 2005, Judge Sand sentenced John Regas to 15 years in federal prison. Timothy Regas received 20 years, a harsher sentence reflecting his role as CFO and his greater responsibility for the financial manipulations. John Regas was sent to the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina, a prison that houses inmates with significant health problems. At 80 years old when he entered prison, Regas was one of the oldest inmates in federal custody. He suffered from various age-related ailments and required regular medical care. His attorneys immediately began seeking compassionate release, arguing that he should be allowed to die at home rather than in prison. While John Regas served his sentence, Adelphia completed its bankruptcy reorganization. The company's assets were sold to Time Warner Cable and Comcast in 2006 for approximately $17.6 billion. The sale marked the end of Adelphia as an independent company. The Regas family's 50-year legacy in the cable industry ended with the company's dissolution. Thousands of Adelphia employees lost their jobs or were transferred to the acquiring companies. Shareholders received nothing. The bankruptcy wiped out their investments completely. The town of Coudersport was devastated. Adelphia had been the largest employer in the region. When the company filed for bankruptcy and eventually dissolved, the economic impact was severe. The Regas family, once celebrated as local heroes, became symbols of betrayal. The golf course and hockey rink they had built with company money stood as reminders of the fraud. The community's trust had been shattered along with Adelphia's collapse. John Regas's health deteriorated significantly during his imprisonment. He developed bladder cancer and other serious medical conditions. By 2015, doctors diagnosed him with terminal cancer. His attorneys again petitioned for compassionate release, arguing that he was no longer a danger to society and that he should be allowed to spend his final months with family. Prosecutors initially opposed the request, but eventually agreed given the severity of his medical condition. On February 19, 2016, after serving approximately 12 years of his 15-year sentence, Judge Sand granted John Regas compassionate release. Regas, now 91 years old and suffering from terminal cancer, was released to home confinement to spend his remaining time with family. He returned to Pennsylvania, a free man but a dying one. John Regas lived for nearly 6 more years after his release, far longer than doctors had predicted. He died on December 30, 2021, at age 96. His death drew limited media coverage. Most Americans had forgotten about Adelphia and the Regas family fraud. But for those who had lost their jobs when the company collapsed, for the shareholders who lost their investments, and for the Coudersport community that had seen its largest employer destroyed, John Regas's death was a reminder of betrayal and lost opportunity. Timothy Regas, who received a longer sentence than his father, was released from federal custody in April 2019 after serving approximately 14 years of his 20-year sentence. He returned to private life, keeping a low profile. The Regas family fortune, once worth billions on paper, had been largely wiped out by fines, restitution payments, and legal fees. What made the Adelphia case stand out was the contrast between John Regas's image and his crimes. He had been celebrated as a self-made success story, an immigrant son who built a cable empire from a small-town movie theater. He had been praised for his loyalty to Coudersport, for keeping Adelphia's headquarters in rural Pennsylvania, rather than moving to a major city. He had been known for his philanthropy and community involvement, but behind that carefully cultivated image, he had been systematically looting the company and deceiving shareholders. The case illustrated the dangers of family-controlled public companies. Adelphia's dual-class stock structure gave the Rigas family control over the company, even though they didn't own a majority of the equity. This control allowed them to install family members in key positions and to operate without meaningful oversight from independent directors. When the family decided to use company money for personal purposes, there was no effective check on their behavior. The fraud also demonstrated how family dynasty mentality can corrupt corporate governance. The Rigas family apparently believed that because John had founded Adelphia and built it into a major company, they had the right to use it however they saw fit. They treated a public company with thousands of shareholders as if it were still the family business John had started in 1952. They failed to recognize that taking a company public creates legal obligations to shareholders that supersede family interests. John Rigas paid a heavy price for his crimes. He spent 12 years in federal prison, from age 80 to 91, years that should have been spent in comfortable retirement. He saw his sons convicted and imprisoned. He watched the company he had spent 50 years building collapse and disappear. His reputation was destroyed. The legacy he had hoped to leave was one of fraud and betrayal rather than entrepreneurship and success. Yet, compared to some other corporate criminals, Rigas received a measure of mercy. His compassionate release allowed him to spend his final years outside prison. He lived to age 96, far longer than many people, regardless of their circumstances. He was able to reconcile with family and die peacefully. These small mercies distinguished his fate from executives like Bernie Madoff, who died in prison without the chance to spend final moments with loved ones. For Adelphia's employees and shareholders, the Rigas family's convictions provided some accountability, but could not restore what was lost. The 15,000 people who lost their jobs when Adelphia collapsed faced unemployment and disrupted careers. The shareholders who invested in Adelphia stock received nothing in the bankruptcy. The billions stolen by the Rigas family were never fully recovered. Restitution orders are meaningless when the perpetrators have no money left to pay. The Adelphia scandal, along with Enron, WorldCom, and other early 2000s corporate frauds, led to reforms in corporate governance. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 imposed new requirements on public companies to prevent fraud and improve oversight. But the reforms could not undo the damage to thousands of people whose lives were disrupted by the Rigas family's crimes. John Rigas's story is ultimately a tragedy of hubris and entitlement. He had built something real and valuable. Adelphia provided cable television to millions of customers and employment to thousands of workers. Rigas could have run the company honestly, maintained his reputation, and left a legitimate legacy. Instead, he and his sons chose to loot the company, treating public shareholders as marks to be exploited. That choice destroyed everything he had built and sent him to prison at an age when most people are enjoying retirement. The small town of Coudersport still bears the scars of Adelphia's collapse. The company headquarters building stands largely empty. The jobs are gone. The Rigas name, once synonymous with success, now carries the stain of fraud. The golf course and hockey rink remain, monuments to a businessman who could have been remembered as a benefactor, but instead will be remembered as someone who betrayed everyone who trusted him. For the people of Coudersport and the thousands of Adelphia employees who lost their livelihoods, John Rigas's comfortable death at 96 offered little solace. The damage was permanent, the betrayal complete, and the lesson clear. Even beloved pillars of the community can be running massive frauds, and even self-made success stories can end in prison and disgrace. These 10 cases expose an uncomfortable truth about American capitalism. The same drive and intelligence that builds billion-dollar empires can, without ethical restraint, become weapons of mass financial destruction. From Madoff's $65 billion theft to Parnell's deadly contaminated peanut butter, each executive made a choice: to lie, to steal, to endanger, for personal gain. Together, they destroyed hundreds of thousands of lives, wiped out retirement savings, killed innocent people, and shattered trust in corporate leadership. Yet their prosecutions also demonstrate progress: longer sentences, criminal accountability for food safety, and recognition that fraud can't hide behind innovation. The message from these prison terms is clear: executive suites don't provide immunity from consequences, and those who abuse positions of ultimate corporate power will ultimately face ultimate accountability. Which of these CEO crimes shocked you most? Madoff's $65 billion Ponzi scheme, Holmes's dangerous fake medical tests, or Parnell shipping poisoned peanut butter that killed 9 people? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into corporate crime and justice.